He fought for humanity until the very end, and was rewarded by being turned into the Empire's hunting dog, used, controlled, and eventually discarded. But instead of dying, he opened his eyes again. This time, not as a weapon, but as the son of the most powerful duke in the Empire. Now he has everything he didn't before: status, talent, and the memories of betrayal. The man who once served the Empire without question, he's about to become the one who destroys it from the inside. One day, a huge monster with incredibly creepy eyes and fangs emerged from the dungeon. It was the year 2045, Earth. Soldiers fought these monsters but were unable to defeat them. Blood spilled everywhere. Fangs sank straight into the backs and chests of these people. They could not defeat such a huge, ominous creature and lay on the ground in a daze. One of the soldiers sadly wondered if this was the end. He bowed to the ground as the monster pounced on him, when suddenly one of the other soldiers managed to protect him and cut one of the monster's limbs. As blood spilled, the monster roared loudly in pain and decided to attack the man. He continued to resist and cut the monster's limbs with his amazingly sharp sword. The man deftly avoided all attacks and, pushing off the ground, ran from place to place. His gaze was confident, and when he rose to his feet, he pointed his pistol to the side and began shooting. Afterwards, he turned and told the soldier to get up, as they had to go. It was Han Sun, the commander-in-chief of the last Earth Defense Forces. The soldier replied, "Yes," and immediately stood up and continued firing at the monster's twisting limbs around him. Humanity has been waging war against monsters for decades, and now, after endless battles, only a small number remain. Their target is finally before their eyes. Han Sun knelt down and continued firing, when suddenly a magic circle with several seals appeared before him. He was dumbfounded and looked at it questioningly, completely confused. What was it? Suddenly, it began to fade, dissolving into pixels, and finally, the portal completely engulfed him. The soldier turned and saw the weapon that remained of the commander and asked in fear, "What?" At that moment, an unknown voice addressed Han Sun and told him to listen to the sound. He was dumbfounded, his mouth open in shock, watching as he was restrained by chains. He didn't think they'd be able to achieve this. So there he was, the hero from the new world they'd heard about. Han Sun wondered, looking at his shackled hands. What were those glowing shackles, and where was he? A man approached him, removing his hood and saying, "Hero of another world, welcome to the Empire." The protagonist looked at him in confusion, and the man explained that while they didn't understand what it was, they were asking him to defeat the Demon King and save their world. Han Sun asked again, "Who is this Demon King? What were they even talking about? Where was he? And who were they?" Now wasn't the time for such conversations. He should be in Korea. The man demanded silence and extended his magical hand to activate the Oath of Peace. At that moment, the protagonist glowed with a bright magical light, and these rays penetrated his skin. He screamed loudly, and the man asked him not to resist. This magic wouldn't harm him if he obeyed, as long as he was polite. The protagonist burst into tears from the horror he'd experienced and tried to calm himself. He wondered if this was really politeness. The man asked him to please defeat the evil Demon King quickly and save their empire. After saying these words, he threw a heavy sword at the protagonist's feet. If he did this, perhaps they could send him back to his home world. Would he accept their request? Everyone crowded around him and looked sharply into his eyes. Han Sun was silent for a moment, unsure of what to say, when he suddenly announced, "Okay, he will do it." So he, Han Sun, had been summoned to a completely different world to fight again as a hero from another world of the Empire. He worked tirelessly and went on countless campaigns. He killed each time in a new way, fulfilling all the Empire's endless requests. 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. He sacrificed his youth to finally defeat the Demon King Valror. Was he finally free? Every night he dreamed of what he would do when he returned home, but then that same old man told him, "Now, Han Sun, he will tell him about his next mission." Han Sun became angry and asked again, "What? That's not what he promised." The old man replied that saving the Empire doesn't end with the death of the Demon King. There are still those who oppose the unification of the Empire, and they must be destroyed. They cannot allow another dissident to emerge. He only needs to take care of one burden for the Empire. He must remove the danger, the Teutonic Knight's kingdom, the Bad-El. Once he removes it, he will finally be free. Let him help them a little longer. Okay? The protagonist became incredibly angry after this conversation, but his neck was once again enveloped in bright rays of light, rendering him unable to move. The dog in the collar has no choice. These freaks are mocking him. When will this finally end? He found himself in the kingdom of the Teutonia Knights, where a man had transported him. A moment later, he destroyed the storm by plunging his sword straight into his chest. He stepped aside and said, "To think he would be such a fool." Han Sun replied that he had no choice. He apologized to him, and Battle asked again, was that Han Sun's otherworldly hero? He shouldn't apologize because soon he too would be thrown out of here. At that moment, Battle fell to the ground and remained in a pool of blood. The protagonist took a closer look at his actions and said that it was over and he could finally return home. At that moment, a knight appeared behind him, approached him, and stabbed him in the back with his sword. Blood spilled from his mouth, and he said, "Well done, hero from another world." The sword passed through his body, and Han Sun froze in pain and horror. It was Count Brandenburg who said he had fought splendidly all these years, doing his job as the Empire's loyal hunting dog well. He was a great general and a holy knight, and he acknowledged it. Han Sun said they were vile hypocrites, meaning it had all been a lie from the start. They had never planned to send him home. Brandenburg asked again, why would they need to do that? A hunting dog only knows how to bite. At that moment, he lifted the protagonist into the air, and then deliberately lowered him to the ground with a loud thud and bid him farewell. Hansen knew they wouldn't let him go so easily, but he still felt hurt and would never forget this humiliation. He was dying in a pool of his own blood, when suddenly a bright beam of light began to emit from his back. He would make the damned empire pay with the complete destruction of this empire. That night, one life closed its eyes, and another opened them. A baby had just been born. His mother was the Duchess, and it was a boy. Elena extended her arms to him and said, "Dear child, she is his mother." Next to her stood the child's father, who looked at the boy in surprise and asked, "Who is this?" He had seen that face before. He realized he remembered everything. This man, he was the greatest necromancer and black magician on the continent. Duke Noir. Then this place must be the capital of the Empire's forbidden magic, Necropolis. That's where the Black Tower is. The Rebirth Stone, which can only work once, had been successfully activated. The Rebirth Stone was the only thing he had been hiding, a forbidden artifact with which he planned to remove his leash, and the body in which he was born was entirely in the hands of fate. But just think, he was born the firstborn of the Duchy of Noir, into one of the Empire's most elite noble families. So this time he was born with a golden spoon in his mouth, right? When he grows up and learns necromancy, he will destroy one of those damned Imperial freaks forever. At that moment, Noir turned to the nanny and said the child wasn't crying. The protagonist looked at him questioningly, and the nanny approached and said it was strange. He was breathing clearly but silent. Elena turned to the nanny and asked if she could take a closer look at his condition. The protagonist, perplexed, thought that he wasn't a child, and tears couldn't be so easily induced. The nanny continued to say that his breathing was stable, so they had nothing to worry about. Noir turned to her and asked if a child's not crying was considered a bad omen. The nanny replied that they had nothing to worry about, His Highness. But if he sincerely wanted him to cry, he could spank him until the tears flowed. At that moment, the nanny began spanking him and laughing, causing Hansun to tense up. He felt uncomfortable and hurt, and he wanted to curse. Noir replied, "What a stubborn child." Elena said he must have inherited his lordship's willpower. Let her handle him. Hansen thought they were just idiots, because their son was fine. When Elena picked him up, she tried to hit him too, causing him to frown, but Elena only stroked him and didn't lay a hand on him. As the warmth of her gentle hand touched his skin, he suddenly remembered something. When was the last time he'd felt such warmth? He recalled the years of his past life. The soft, trembling hand of the young diplomatic lady, his new mother, radiated a love he hadn't known in years. Hansun, who hadn't shed tears since he was old enough to reflect, couldn't help but weep. 8 years had passed since Dale was born. Noir rose from his bed and said that time seemed to fly by. Elena confirmed this thought and asked if Dale was still in the study. He hadn't looked up from his books since he was 4. Noir replied that he must have taken after her. He seemed interested in magic. At that moment, Elena turned his face to her and said, "Alan, he hasn't forgotten the promise he made about her, has he?" he asked. Does Elena mean the promise that he wouldn't teach Dale necromancy? Elena replied that this meant he remembered. Noir confirmed. Of course he does, my dear. Don't worry. His gift to Dale for his birthday tomorrow? But before he could finish the sentence, he suddenly heard a noise outside the door. There was a knock, and a servant who arrived in the room shouted, "Your Grace, young Master Dale." But before she could finish the sentence, his parents tensed and became frightened. They immediately ran into his room and shouted, "Dale, is he all right?" Hansun, meanwhile, was lying on the floor, radiating blue energy. He became wary and turned around, saying, "Mom, Dad." He had taught himself this magic, and his parents shouted, "Dale." Elena ran closer to him and asked, "Are you hurt? What just happened?" He replied, "I'm all right, Mom." And Noir held out his hand, feeling mana floating in the air. He was only 8 years old, and he could already release mana. Dale begged his mother to please let him go while she held his cheeks, and at that moment, Noir asked, did he release mana from his body? The phrase seemed threatening, and Hansun knew he would find it strange, and that he had screwed up. Even he didn't know he could release mana so soon. But he turned to his father, unsure what to say, because if he didn't answer quickly, they might become suspicious of his true identity. Noir smiled and said what was to be expected from his son. He patted his head and said it was a pity he couldn't teach him necromancy. Dale asked himself again, can't he teach him necromancy? Then what about his revenge? Elena was delighted and said the servants would clean everything up, so he should quickly return to his room. He replied, "Yes, Mom." At that moment, Noir turned to Elena and said he was thinking of gifts for Dale. Sometime later, a banquet was held to celebrate Dale's birthday. Many distinguished guests had gathered in the hall. They were discussing their visit to this event. Today was the young master's birthday. Of course they had to come. It seemed all the nobles belonging to the Black Duke's territory had gathered. One of the curious individuals asked, "By the way, when will the young master arrive?" Someone was commenting on how long they hadn't had such a grand banquet. It seemed a bit late, but it was already very lively. In the banquet hall on the second floor, the protagonist sat, his head bowed in sadness. To think that all these people had gathered just to celebrate his birthday. It was so tiring. Perhaps because he had become accustomed to being treated like a failure since his days as a hero, being treated like a young master still made him feel uneasy. At that moment, someone knocked on his door, and he continued to think. Besides, he was still upset about the destruction of the table the other day. He couldn't believe his mana had gone berserk just from remembering his time as a hero. He wondered who brought this book, the biography of a hero from another world. That he hadn't thought about it? This body had too much talent to give up necromancy. How was he supposed to convince his father? He vaguely heard him say that he thought gifts were a good idea. Maybe he should try asking him to teach him necromancy, but it probably wouldn't work. He looked at his mother, who entered the room and apologized for keeping him waiting. He was glad to see his mother, and she congratulated him on his 8th birthday. Dale turned to her and asked who the person behind her was. She asked to be allowed to introduce them. Next to her stood a hooded girl, covering herself and not showing her face. Elena informed him that she was the elder of the Blue Magic Tower and a master of water magic. This is the illuminated Lady Sepia. She will be his teacher. The protagonist looked at her in bewilderment, and Sepia said that she looks forward to the opportunity to work with him. Elena congratulated her son in this way and whispered a happy birthday in his ear. Han-sun was dumbfounded. Did they really hire the elders from the Blue Tower as his teacher? In that case, they intend to teach him water magic, which is aimed at protection and destruction. As he thought, his mother does not want him to study dark magic. At that moment, Sepia turned to him and asked if they could talk alone. He answered, "Yes, Teacher Sepia." After a while, they went outside into the snowy forest. Sepia said that perhaps he had already heard, but she was asked to teach him only water magic. He was not disappointed. She was sure he would like to learn another type of magic. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked, but how did she know about this? Sepia replied that it was only natural that he wanted to learn his father's necromancy, dark magic. However, the conditions for the Black Duke's marriage were a well-known fact in the Empire. During the Black Duke's courtship of Lady Elena, she was frightened by his ill repute. For her sake, he promised that his dark legacy would not be passed on to his heir. On their wedding day, the elder of the Black Tower wore snow-white robes instead of their usual black robes. Since their marriage was based on such a vow, it would be difficult for him to immediately study dark magic. But she would find a way to convince Lady Elena. So, does he accept her teachings? Han-sun was surprised and asked again, "Teacher, isn't she bothered by dark magic or necromancy? For an elf who values the laws of nature, resurrecting the dead must be something strange." She chuckled and said, "How funny. So the holy power of the priests that resurrects the dead is part of the will of nature?" Han-sun was surprised by these words and did not answer. Necromancy or resurrection were the same thing in her opinion. Han-sun was surprised and his mouth fell open in amazement. She was very different from the usual narrow-minded elves, and perhaps she was a much better teacher than he thought. Sepia asked, "Well, should they begin their lesson now?" She heard that a few days ago he created a fragment of a mana circle. She suggested that he set their first target. This would expand this fragment and form a single circle. He was surprised. The first circle? That was perfect. The magic books he had read required using the first circle, and he should seize this opportunity. Sepia asked him to place his hand on his heart and concentrate. He replied, "Yes, teacher." When he placed his hand on his heart, he realized that this world was different from Earth. This world was filled with mana. However, unless he was an ancient creature like a dragon, handling raw mana in this way was impossible. Therefore, to filter and process this raw mana, a heart mana circle was necessary. After collecting and arranging the scattered fragments of mana around the heart, he needed to make the assembled circle rotate evenly around it. This meant that the circle was the process of imprinting the pathways through which it enters the heart. Just as Teacher Sepia had told him, he was able to create bright rays of light around himself by using mana. At that moment, Sepia told him to begin carefully rotating the mana around the heart. This usually takes about a month, so he shouldn't rush. At that moment, he looked at his hands and turned to the teacher, asking again, "Like that?" She was dumbfounded, unsure what to say. Asking again, "What? Is it possible for a child who has just begun training to form a protective circle for minutes? What if he is a gifted child with a talent for magic?" At that moment, Han-sun released magical rays of light from his hands and smiled as he took advantage of them. Sepia looked at him in surprise and asked, "Dale, could he try releasing his magical power through the circle?" He replied that he would try it now. Normally, even releasing mana through a circle isn't always easy for beginners, but at this level, he wouldn't be able to exact revenge on the Empire, let alone catch up with Duke Noir. In his previous life, he could only use deadly combat magic with the magical engravings on his body. But this time, things would be different. This body, having inherited the talent of the Lord of the Black Tower, naturally absorbs mana. Perhaps he could learn not only water magic, but other forms of magic as well. Now he needed to focus and allow the mana he had accepted as his calling to flow to his fingertips and create it. The most deadly shard, aimed at the Empire's throat, was a stone that could create a defense for minutes. Sepia, watching the scene, mused that mana usually dissipates upon exiting the body, but he crystallized magical power to create a rather perfect ice bolt. Since he was concentrating on the form, the destructive power might not be enough. The protagonist continued to use his abilities and suddenly struck a nearby tree, which glowed with magical light and, a moment later, exploded and collapsed. When the tree fell, Sepia turned around in bewilderment. She was deeply alarmed by this episode. He had created a stone sharp and hard enough to pierce the tree. This is not the level of precision a mere 8-year-old can demonstrate. She turned to him in horror and Han-sun waved at her with a smile. Sepia wondered who really stood before her. As she lowered herself closer to the tree, she just touched it and said, "Oh my god." She thought it would be mana transfer at best, but it turned out to be an ice element used during the mana release. It was basic magic. But who would have thought it would penetrate magic that so perfectly absorbed nearby cold? Han-sun turned to her and asked, "Master, did he do something wrong?" Elena turned to him with a smile and remained silent. The complexity of the magic formula was far beyond what an innocent child could unknowingly create. This rotation, acceleration, and overload magic incorporated 3 formulas known as the golden ratio of combat magic. That he could unknowingly project and cast such a completely deadly spell was simply astonishing. He turned to his teacher again, and Sepia waved her hand and said it was nonsense, and she understood why the Duke might consider it regrettable. Sometime later, Sepia arrived at the palace and, turning to Noir, told him everything she thought. Noir asked again, what did she mean she couldn't teach Dale? She remained silent, and Noir continued that if he had reached the first circle in just a few minutes, then she should definitely teach him. She replied that as soon as young Lord Dale reached the first circle, he immediately cast a perfect killing spell. At that moment, Noir was dumbfounded and horrified. It was hard to believe that a mere 8-year-old child had done this. A battle magic formula was used to create it. It was in the perfect golden ratio. She informed the Duke that young Lord Dale has a talent for murder. At that moment, Noir frowned and said, "So she says this as an elder of the Blue Magic Tower who opposes violence. She can't teach Dale?" Sepia replied that that was not the case at all. If anything happened, she felt a strong desire to guide him on the path of truth with her own hands. Noir replied that in that case, she had no reason to refuse. At that moment, Sepia said, "Duke's dark magic. It seems young Master Dale has already mastered the magic he wanted to learn." At that moment, Noir was stunned. He didn't know what to say, and Sepia said that she had heard a lot about his love story. She respected the promises he made to Lady Elena, but that didn't give him the right to decide the future of his child, especially if it was someone with such great talent as young Master. Han-sun tried to eavesdrop on their conversation while standing outside the door and didn't hear anything at all. He sat down on the floor and wondered, they're talking about him, right? He didn't expect his first spell to display such power. Tower Master Sepia looked very surprised. From now on, he would have to control his power more carefully. At that moment, his uncle approached him and asked, "Young Master Dale?" The protagonist was delighted when he saw him and exclaimed, "Uncle Helmut." Helmut asked with a smile, "What is he doing here?" Han-sun asked if he could ask him first where he'd been. Helmut grinned and replied that he'd been away fulfilling his duty to protect the ducal family. He reached out to embrace him, adding that he needed to defeat some terrifying monsters. He picked Dale up and tossed him above him to play. Dale asked again. He was in a dungeon, right? At that moment, he grew sad and reflected that in this world, the appearance of a dungeon or an infestation of monsters is a serious problem for any territory. When the Demon King was still alive, monsters attacking civilian areas caused great damage. That's why the knights of each house prioritize clearing unexplored dungeons in the Demon King's territory, or destroying monsters that have entered dungeons through breaches. The situation in the Saxon Duchy, in particular, is several times more serious than in other territories. He is the reason for this. After his past life, the hero of the New World defeated the Demon King. Duke Noir was ordered to transform the Demon King's territory into imperial territory by subjugating the monsters inhabiting it. Technically, this is called discarding the remains. Dale asked his uncle Helmut to take care of himself, and he asked again, "Is he worried about him, young lord?" At that moment, someone entered their room and said, "It seems he's in good health." They both turned to see Noir enter the room. Helmut greeted Duke Noir, who responded that he appreciated his hard work during the recent dungeon raid. Elena also entered the room and asked, "Are they all gathered here already?" Dale wondered, "What's Mom doing here?" Elena saw him and said his name with admiration, after which she came closer and said that she heard he had reached the first circle and that she was very proud of him. Noir replied, "I see. He congratulates him." Elena turned around and told him that if he had anything he wanted, he should tell his father right now. Dale wondered if he'd asked him to teach him necromancy. Would he have resorted to trickery? What could children that age dream of? He replied that he wanted a little sister, and his parents were deeply embarrassed after his expressed wish. He replied that they would try their best, and Dale replied, "Yes, father." At that moment, Helmut grinned, and his subordinate asked the captain to restrain himself. Night fell, and the entire palace was illuminated by bright moonlight. Han-sun lay down on his bed and thought that trying to act childish was simply terrible. He felt tired, and it was probably because he had used magic. When he fell asleep, he remembered his past life and had a terrible dream. He was met by Brandenburg, who said he was glad to see him again. It had been a long time since they had seen each other, hadn't it? People are so cunning, don't you think? It's so easy for a person to become soft, right? He was happy that he now had a wonderful home and loving parents. Now that he was warm and cozy, he didn't think so much about revenge, did he? The Empire will find him, Han-sun. They will search for him until they kill him, and until all traces of him disappear from the face of the earth. At that moment, Han-sun abruptly woke up as a bright light emanated from his chest. He tried to catch his breath and clutched his chest, thinking that his heart felt like it was about to burst. This murder he heard about? Damn the Empire. With these thoughts, he left his room, knowing that they simply wouldn't let him go until the very end. Han-sun went outside without winter clothes and thought that he would feel better if he got some fresh air, but he only got worse. He continued to hold his chest and stomach, not knowing what to do, when he suddenly met Sepia in the forest, who said that it seemed like he was in a difficult situation. He was dumbfounded when he heard her words, and turned around, asking, "Teacher Sepia?" She looked at him and thought, "A riot of mana, huh? He's such a talented child. However, she couldn't shake the feeling of danger. At that moment, she placed her hand on his chest and tried to help him. Once malice takes hold of this child's magic, it would be irreversible. When she cast the spell, Hansun was surprised that the killing had stopped. She addressed him by name, and he asked again, "What?" Sepia replied that the essence of magic is the mirror of the heart. That's why every mage has their own individuality, even if they use the same magic. His talent in magic lies in taking the lives of others, and it's a very dangerous talent. She held a book in her hand and said that this is why she considered it fortunate that she would be teaching him. She handed the book over to him, and he asked again, "Teacher?" Hansun realized it was a necromancer's magic tome. Sepia replied that perhaps it was fate, that she would be with him from now on. She smiled and wished him a happy birthday. Hansun was overjoyed and hugged her around the waist, burying his face in her belly. She asked again, "He needs help, doesn't he?" A few days later, outside the northern gate plains, Sepia was with Hansun, who looked ahead and wondered, "Are those rabbits?" She replied, "Yes." Let him remember hunting with his father. He formed a magical seal in his hand and replied, "Yes, teacher," then aimed it at the rabbit. A bright beam of light pierced the creature with sharp magical stones, and everything around him glowed with its bright sparks. Sepia, watching, thought that despite taking another's life, his hands didn't tremble. Sepia said, "Dale, even if it's the same spell, the form of this infinite varies from mage to mage. Does he know the reason for this?" He replied, "No, why?" Sepia explained that it was because a person's magic is ultimately a mirror reflecting them all at once. It materializes what lies within their heart through mana particles. Therefore, magic inevitably reveals the landscape of a person's inner being. Hansun silently pondered this, and Sepia continued by saying that terms like firewalls are merely stepping stones for developing the imagination, allowing one to strengthen a mental image. Even the magic taught in the magic towers is no different. The red magic tower values order through strength. The blue magic tower values order through harmony. The philosophy of each magic tower is embodied in the form of their magic. The philosophy dedicated to each magic tower forms the basis of their magic system. And in addition to the red and blue magic towers, there are also black, white, and green magic towers. After this, she breathed a sigh of relief, and Hansun wondered. Sepia continued that she thought it was too early for him. The most basic form of necromancy is zombie raising. This is the art of reviving a corpse using mana threads to control it. The protagonist focused all his power on the rabbit to revive it, the head, spine, and knees. By attaching mana threads to them, he was able to reincarnate the rabbit. Sepia praised him for his work and asked if he could move on to the next one right away. He replied, "Yes, master." He had frozen armor, and his eyes glowed with a bright magical light. When he touched the ground with his hand, magic began to spread around him at the speed of light. A bright beam pierced the rabbit that was wearing this armor. He created excellent frozen armor, and the shape was suitable for a hare. She offered to test his defenses. At that moment, Hansun tensed, and a moment later she attacked the rabbit with this armor, which crumbled slightly, but still protected this creature. Hansun was glad that it worked, and he blocked her shot, "Teacher." Sepia said that it was excellent work, and it seemed he wanted to say something. Something on the tip of his tongue? Hansun replied yes, he would like her to teach him how to better use water magic. She smiled and said no. Hansun was surprised and asked again, "What?" Sepia replied that what he did today was a very simple form of water magic, but like all magic, the water attribute requires deeper insight and a higher level of understanding as it develops. Most beginners struggle to master even one type of magic. Mastering two types simultaneously is what they call a dual mage. At his age, it's nearly impossible, and to her, it seems like excessive ambition on his part. His mouth dropped in surprise, and he asked again, "What? Ambition?" After everything he'd shown her, she still thought it wasn't enough. Hansun turned to her and said that she herself had said they would find their way forward together, but now she was saying the opposite. Sepia lowered her gaze and abruptly replied that today's lesson was over. That night, in the study, the protagonist entered the library and collected several important books. There was nothing he couldn't do alone. He would perform so well that she would have no choice but to teach him. He began reading the necessary and important spell books, and a pink aura appeared around him. The next day, when he went out into the forest with Sepia, he dozed off because he hadn't gotten enough sleep the night before. Sepia asked if he was okay. It looked like he hadn't slept a wink. He replied that he just stopped for a bit to prepare something. Sepia asked him not to strain himself, and he held out his hand and replied, "Yes, teacher." At that moment, a seal of magical dark light appeared from his hand and surrounded the rabbit. Sepia noted with joy that he had already fully mastered it. Suddenly, the protagonist began to destroy this magical barrier and exploded the ice. Sepia didn't understand and was dumbfounded. What had just happened? Was that all? A bright purple beam of light emerged from within the rabbit and pierced the creature completely, and a moment later, a bright magical explosion erupted in the forest. Sepia was dumbfounded by what she saw and realized what it was. A multitude of bright fragments flew past her, and she silently looked at Dale. He said, "Corpse explosion and ice explosion." He combined the properties of water and darkness into one. Could he really be considered a dual mage with so many abilities? At that moment, he held water magic in one hand and dark magic flowing from him in the other, smiling despite his teacher. When Sepia looked into the distance at the destroyed rabbit, she realized this was an attack method she'd never seen before. Combined with the ice explosion from the frozen armor, the corpse explosion spread across a larger area, and it didn't end there. as so much ice and bones flew like blades. It's almost as if this magic is used only for killing, and it would be used by someone who has dedicated their entire lives to battle. What form does this child's mental image take? At that moment, Han-sun turned to the other side of the forest and saw his beloved uncle. He rejoiced, and Helmet raised his hand and shouted, "Young master, Lady Sepia." Han-sun asked if he had just returned from another dungeon raid. Helmet, sitting on horseback, replied that this time they had repelled a small group of monsters. The Black Cavalry had been through a lot. The Black Cavalry, armed with spears coated in aura, are the unrivaled cavalry of the Duchy of Saxony. In addition, their knight, Captain Sir Helmut, is one of the 7 sword masters on the continent. He hadn't forgotten their promise to teach him swordsmanship, right? Han-sun dreamed of learning swordsmanship from a person of high status. This was a wonderful opportunity. Suddenly, Helmet laughed and shouted, "Of course not." Han-sun waved at him. "See you later then, Uncle Helmet." He replied, "Okay," and asked him not to linger here for long. It's too cold everywhere. He should take care of himself. They said goodbye, and Sepia suggested Han-sun return to the palace. He replied, "Okay, master." That night, the protagonist showed a new side of himself to his teacher, and she came to his mother, Elena. She asked, "What did you mean, Lady Sepia?" Sepia continued to tell everyone that everything was as she had said. Young Master Dale had completed his first round of necromancy and water magic. Noir said so, but they had only asked her to teach him water magic. Sepia confirmed this thought, but lowered her gaze and said that, however, as his mentor, she wanted to teach him everything he wanted to learn. As she had already said, young Master Dale wanted to learn more than just water magic. After a moment of silence, Elena asked if Dale wanted to. Could she please continue his water magic training? Sepia replied, "Of course. From now on, she will also take care of him." The parents thanked the teacher, and Sepia left the office, but before leaving, she sincerely apologized for breaking her promise. Elena remarked that their child was undoubtedly extraordinary, wasn't he? She can't believe he became a dual mage at such a young age, just 8. Although he does frighten her from time to time, he should be capable of it, since he's their child. Noir turned to Elena with fear and said that he would like to teach Dale necromancy. At that moment, he lowered his gaze and completely wilted. He continued to say that he wanted to give him the power to fulfill the duties of a lord and at the same time make him an excellent student. As his father, he wanted their son to inherit his legacy. He clutched his head and apologized to his wife again. Elena said that public opinion about necromancy still leaves much to be desired, and people fear it and call it death magic. That's why she wants to dissuade him, but let him teach him so that he becomes a necromancer who could ignore the perception of necromancy by others. She responded lovingly to this proposal and hugged Noir, stroking his face. After that, she pulled him close and asked again, "Okay?" Noir was silent for a moment, then brightened and said, "Okay, Elena." They hugged, and Noir swears with everything he holds dear that he will make their son the best. And so, their first day of specialized necromancy training began. Noir said he was very disappointed in him, Dale. He was reviving lives without even realizing he was controlling them. Han-sun thought about it. This was all his teacher had taught him. He couldn't do anything about it. A magical workshop located underground in Duke Noir's palace. As soon as he showed his father the basics of necromancy he'd learned from his teacher, he sighed and brought him here. Noir informed him that while he was teaching him, he shouldn't even think about using such a basic necromancy spell. He would start with memorizing the bone and muscle structure of all life forms. Did he understand? Han-sun was stunned and replied, "Yes, father." All the books his father had given him after he'd memorized every letter were professional books that only doctors could read in his world. After some time, Noir closed the book and declared that he'd mastered the basics. He was finally allowed to move on to practical magic. Now they would begin the real lesson. Han-sun replied, "Okay, father." At that moment, he looked ahead in surprise as Noir placed a goblin on the table. Han-sun was surprised. Could this really be a goblin corpse? Noir responded, seeming deeply perplexed, and chuckled. An inexperienced mage could only make a master swordsman's corpse move like a zombie. On the other hand, an experienced person could transform an ordinary soldier into a death knight, and now this was an ordinary undead soldier. How would he control it? Han-sun was a little frightened and held out his magical hand, thinking that unlike a rabbit, which was small and consisted of only a few bones, a goblin was much more difficult to control because it was bipedal and had to be bound together by numerous threads of mana. He should fire now. It would be like trying to control a complex puppet. At that moment, he tensed up and actually tried to use his powers, wondering if it had been a mistake to use posthumous cruelty to strengthen his defense. This creature's joints were frozen and he couldn't move them. What should he do in this situation? At that moment, Noir placed his hand on his son's shoulder and said, "Dale, while it might be a good idea to strengthen this creature's body by increasing its post-mortem rigidity, the downside is that it limits the corpse's movement." Han-sun was dumbfounded when he heard this, and Noir asked him to watch his movements. At that moment, he generated magic in his hands and directed it at the goblin. Han-sun gaped in surprise and watched every movement carefully. The goblin was shrouded in dark magic, and rib cages were originally designed to protect human internal organs, but there was no need to protect the organs of the dead, was there? He must understand the structure of his target and modify it to suit his needs. Han-sun was even more surprised when he heard this, and Noir explained that this was precisely the basis of black magic. After that, He turned to his father and asked him to teach him the mentality of a black magic tower. Noir wasn't surprised, and smiling, asked, does he want him to tell him the truth? The truth always exists within death. Therefore, they must understand the burden of life in order to get to the truth. He wrapped his arms around his son's shoulders, who looked him intently in the eyes. At that moment, he remembered himself from his past life and the man who knelt before him, begging him to save his life. The protagonist swung his sword while the man begged him not to kill him. But a moment later, his head flew off. At that moment, he felt uneasy, and Noir called his name and asked if he was all right. He didn't look well. Hansun blushed with horror and realized that he was fine, and he answered so. He recalled his past life and couldn't tear himself away. As Dale's magical talents developed, news of Duke Noir teaching Dale dark magic spread throughout the Empire. Duke Noir's violation of his oaths caused a huge stir in the Empire. As for the man who broke that very oath, he attracted the attention of all the inhabitants of the Empire, and they all focused on him. Hansun continued training, and a few weeks later found himself at the duchy's training grounds. He was training alongside his uncle and working diligently. Helmut looked at his nephew in surprise, watching him work diligently. They were still fighting with wooden swords, and suddenly, the protagonist saw a bright beam of light in front of him. He stepped back a little, when suddenly a bright flash of light formed between them. Helmut looked to the side and was surprised to see his sword fly off. He shouted with a grin that his master had done well. Hansun replied that a knight like him would never drop his sword. He let it go on purpose, didn't he? Helmut replied, of course not. Since he used swordsmanship techniques used in real combat, an ordinary person would die in a single fight. Hansun clasped his sword in his hands, and looking at them, Helmut continued to say that his swordsmanship is so excellent that he can confidently say he is a mage. Since a mage always has knights by his side to protect him, he really doesn't need to train so hard. Is there a reason he's doing this? He doesn't need to get himself into such a state. Hansun held out his hand and answered, of course there is. It wouldn't be good for the Duke's son to rely solely on guards or defensive magic, would it? Besides, how could he miss the chance to learn swordsmanship directly from one of the continent's 7 swordmasters? Helmut smiled and shouted mockingly that this was an excellent answer. If he had a son like him, he wouldn't regret anything. Hansun replied that the day had finally come when he deserved his praise. At that moment, Elena approached them, rustling her dress. She said that they both seemed in high spirits. The guys turned in her direction, and Hansun asked what brought her here. It was cold outside, after all. She replied that she wanted to see how hard her son was working, and she had some news for him. He asked again. What? Elena asked him again. Did he remember the birthday present he asked for? Hansun thought about it, and realized that maybe yes. Let her remind him what it was. That's right, he asked for a younger sister. At that moment, he was dumbfounded, and Elena smiled because he would have to take good care of his little sister, Dale. She was pregnant and holding her belly. Hansun was delighted and said of course. 10 months later, they had a little princess in their house. Isn't she so charming? Dale lay on the bed with his mother and answered, yes, of course. He still can't believe that he now has a sister. She is so incredibly cute. He tried to touch her face with his hands, and Elena asked, he wants to hold her? At that moment, he exclaimed, what? Elena told him not to be shy, and not to be afraid to hold the baby in his arms. He grabbed her in his arms, and Noira said that as soon as he really hugged her, it was not as difficult as he thought. So what does he think? She's very similar to him, isn't she? Hansun continued to hold his sister in his arms and remained silent. Elena responded that it was strange. She cried every time she picked her up, but never cried when he did. She seemed quite happy. Dale smiled, looking at her face, and suddenly his parents asked how he felt now. She was light as a feather. Hansun replied that she would feel that heavy. Noir smiled and replied that this was the meaning of life. He must never forget that. Now, isn't it time for him to begin the lesson? Come on, he's sure that teacher Sepia is waiting for him. After a while, Hansun emerged into the snowy forest, and Sepia informed him that today's lesson was real combat practice. He asked again, should he act seriously? Sepia told him not to hesitate and to attack with all his might. He replied that he understood everything, teacher, and set his magic seal. Sepia thought she wanted to see how much he had improved. A moment later, a sharp shard was aimed straight at her head, and she reacted silently, thinking that his first strike was too slow. A moment later, he struck again, and Sepia spoke with brazen insolence. A student is lenient toward his teacher? She grabbed the shard in her hand, and Hansun realized he needed to strike harder. At that moment, Sepia shouted, barrier, quickly. He froze in fear and covered his face with his hand. He knew that if he hadn't blocked it, he would have been seriously injured. Sepia thought about how he'd managed to create ice armor in such a short time, and that impressed her. The ice armor crumbled on his hand, and Sepia suggested doing it again. Hansun touched the ground with his hand and said, molecular combination, ice wall formula. Let the ice wall rise now. At that moment, he created a protective wall-like barrier of ice around himself, and Sepia was stunned. He'd created an ice wall in the midst of battle. By improving his mana structure, he'd significantly increased the ice's density, and it was truly powerful. Sepia approached closer and wondered, but why use a defensive spell now? Maybe he needed a break after her last attack? At that moment, she turned around questioningly, and saw that the protagonist was using an ice blast, a fragmentation formula. He was confident in his actions, and a bright flash of light appeared in front of Sepia. She was dumbfounded and realized it was a grenade, then covered her face with her hands. Hansun realized it had worked. The spell cast just now had compacted the sturdy long wall even more than before and detonated it. Since the ice molecules had already been strengthened before compression, it practically turned into a grenade. This will be difficult to avoid, Master. When the dust cleared, Hansun looked ahead and did not find Sepia. He asked, Master? He was very frightened and shouted her name again, when suddenly Sepia hid behind her frightened shadow and asked again, did he call her? He replied that it really scared him. Then it must be an illusion. She grinned and replied that it was quite an impressive technique. She never thought a mere first circle mage would be capable of injuring the elder of the magic tower. He replied that he never wanted to hurt her teacher, and Sepia replied that she knew that. She was truly grateful for the wound he inflicted on her today. He asked, what? Sepia replied, it means he trusted her enough to use all his power, right? As his teacher, she was prouder of him than words could ever express. He asked, is that true? And Sepia continued, of course it is. He's an excellent student. How did he even come up with such a spell formula? He clutched his head and, smiling, replied that it was all thanks to what she taught him. Sepia looked down, lost in thought, a smile on her face. A moment later she found herself in Noir's office, and her face no longer expressed such joy. Noir asked where she got that wound on her cheek. She replied that she had been careless and realized it near the young master. His formula was remarkably precise. Noir replied that he was always in her debt. Sepia countered that it was nonsense, as it was a great joy for her to teach such a talented student like him. Noir asked if it would be okay if he asked her again. Sepia smiled and replied, of course. And Noir continued that they had received word that a group of orcs had crossed the mountain range and invaded their territory, nothing a small cavalry unit couldn't handle. Nevertheless, he intended to send Dale to this battle. At that moment, Sepia froze and said the young master wasn't ready yet. Noir replied that he hadn't expected him to fight on the front lines now. Nevertheless, defending the territory was the responsibility of House Noir. He stood up and spoke out, emitting his dark aura that as the Duke's heir, he must understand his responsibility, and Dale was no exception. Sepia asked again, what should she do? He replied that he would give Dale his artifact and wanted her to control it. He hadn't yet learned to control its power. An artifact is an object imbued with immense strength and willpower. It can be used by offering a person mana or life itself as payment. The more powerful the artifact, the more dangerous and uncontrollable it becomes, and in some cases, it can even lead to mental collapse. Noir explained that House Saxe had long mastered the art of manipulating such powers. They were standing in front of the Saxe artifact vault. He turned to Dale and informed him that, as the Duke's heir, he too must prepare for the upcoming battle. Dale, surprised and frightened, asked again, what a battle? He thought to himself, finally. Noir said yes, he had joined the squad to destroy the orcs. However, before that, he must first learn to control the power of darkness that their family wields. They entered a special cabinet where several artifacts were hidden. The protagonists looked around in surprise and exclaimed in delight. Noir explained that these were the Demon King's artifacts they controlled and had possessed them since their ancestors conquered the Demon King's domain. Noir told him never to compare them to ordinary mortal objects. Hansun expressed the feeling of powerful mana emanating from them. Noir confirmed that they were indeed powerful and extremely dangerous, and until he learned to control them, he should not touch anything thoughtlessly. At that moment, Hansun seemed to be outside of this space and within himself. Noir asked again, Dale? Where did that boy go? Hansun had already headed to the place he was interested in. A moment ago, he realized he needed a suitable artifact. He heard a sound coming from one of the artifacts. He has people he wants to take revenge on, right? It senses his hatred and offers to kill them together, so let him choose that particular item. All the artifacts began arguing among themselves over his choice, begging him to take them. Hansun realized these dark artifacts resonated with his deepest resentment, but that wasn't enough. He needed something far more powerful. He saw a cloak behind him and asked, when did this cloak arrive? He paused and realized it was a shadow cloak. During the Hero's Age, Duke Bertha of the Demon King's army used this top-tier artifact. It had the ability to transfer form to shadows, making him an incredibly difficult opponent. Hansun knew he had to try it, so he donned the artifact. When Noir and Master Sepia saw it, they exclaimed his name, and he turned to look at them questioningly. At that moment, a dark aura enveloped him, repeatedly declaring it was hungry. So it all begins. This is no ordinary shadow. Whoever mastered it in the past could summon shadow storms and move darkness as if it were a living being. However, to truly control it, the master must force the shadow creature to submit completely. So it won't be easy, right? Hansun looked at his hands, where the dark energy was concentrated, and was horrified to find himself inside this dark magical epicenter. The teacher and Noir watched in bewilderment. Noir clutched his head, unsure what to do, and Sepia said that it was getting late. Should they worry? Noir replied that if this continued, he would lose his mind and be eaten by a shadow creature. She asked again, what? Well, then they needed to act. Noir said that they would have to pull him out by force. At that moment, a strong wind arose in the room, and a bright light shone directly into the eyes of the teacher and father. The magic circle evaporated, and Dale found himself back in the room. Noir asked again. Dale? He smiled and replied, yes, father. Sepia ran closer to him and asked if he was okay. He replied that he was fine, and Sepia said that he had made her worry. He replied that it had only slightly affected him. Noir couldn't understand how he could remain unharmed. How could a child master such a powerful artifact? Hansun turned to his father and said he had a question and asked him to speak. Hansun asked if he could touch the other artifacts too. Noir and Sepia were dumbfounded by this question, and Noir suggested that he try. Hansun thanked him, and thus began Dale's exploration of the Sachs family artifact vault. It was something that took all day and all night. A few days later, at the ducal family's training grounds, Helmut mentioned to the young master that this thing he was currently wearing was a shadow cloak. He replied with a smile, yes, that's right. Helmut scratched his head in confusion and said that people were saying this artifact was incredibly difficult to control. Was he really okay? He grinned and replied that he was fine, and that aside from a slight tingling sensation, everything was fine. Helmut replied that it was surprising, and Hansun said that perhaps he had been alone for a long time. As soon as he saw him, he clung to him. Maybe he just wanted to befriend him? Helmut laughed and shouted, to think he'd call something so dangerous lonely. He's too kind. Hansun thanked Uncle Helmut for these words, and said that he had a favor to ask. Helmut asked again what he wanted. He replied that he would like to arrange for a real guy to serve as combat practice. Helmut exclaimed, of course he can do that. He will do everything possible not to disappoint him. Hansun thought that meeting one of the continent's 7 swordmasters might still be an impossible task. His aura alone instilled fear in him. Helmut asked him not to be afraid, and that he would fight him using only the basics of swordsmanship, without using aura. Hansun mentally thought, does he mean he won't be so harsh with him? But a knight must fight seriously, and that's their credo. His true goal in this sparring isn't the duel itself, but to practice using the shadow cloak. The power of the weapons he can create from shadow creatures will determine the true value of the artifact, and this battle will be a necessary test. At that moment, he used the shadow blade throw and pounced on the terrified Helmut, who began to fend off the attack with incredible terror. He couldn't understand. Had he really blocked the blow with strength alone? It was simply incredible. Helmut grinned and shouted that this was excellent, and now he would attack him first. When Helmut tried to attack the protagonist, he rolled back slightly, and Helmut, greatly alarmed, looked questioningly at Hansun. It was an unexpected attack. How fascinating. Hansun was incredibly frightened and tried to deflect the dark rays of light that were creeping closer to him, when he suddenly used magical powers and deflected them with ease. Helmut was dumbfounded, and looked at his nephew in surprise. Thinking that he had blocked that blow, he struck with enough force to break an ordinary sword in half. That's the difference between a common weapon and a high-level artifact. Helmut shouted for him to perform 10 more exchanges, and the battle continued. That day, the knights watching the duel whispered among themselves in disbelief. None of them had ever endured more than 2 exchanges with Captain Helmut. They felt an indescribable wall rise between them and Dale. Dale turned to the knights and looked at them questioningly. A few days later, on the day of deployment, Elena said she would speak with his father again. No matter what he thought, she couldn't let him go to such a dangerous place. Hansun told his mother not to worry, because Dad and Uncle Helmut would be there. Elena asked, but what if something goes wrong and he gets hurt? Hansun's gaze grew sad and, turning to his mother again, he said he needed to become stronger so that one day he could bear the burden of the duchy. When the time comes, he will need the strength to protect her, his father, and his sister, Liz. That's why this experience is so important to him now. Please, he wants to become strong enough to protect her. Elena sadly replied, okay, then let our son go. Hansun mounted his horse and said he would return soon. They would be at the temporary base by dawn. The knights reported that the troops were ready to depart, and Noir replied, okay. He turned to Dale and told him to give the order to move out in his place. Dale, surprised, asked again, what? Noir replied that one day he would command their proud cavalry corps, the Black Cavalry. These were his knights. He was dumbfounded that these were Dale's knights, not Hansun's, and this would be his first battle as their leader. Yes, this time everything would be different. He turned to the knights and announced that the time had come. In time, proud and of the swords of the House of Saxony. The knights shouted back, yes, young lord. He announced that all troops were to take their positions. This operation would involve 250 cavalry and elite units stationed in the White Mountains, the Winter Guard. Their target was approximately 1,000 orcs. The orcs had crossed the mountains, heading upstream along the Saxon River to escape the cold and hunger. They would soon move downstream. They would strike intermittently, crossing the lower mouth of the Saxon River and setting an ambush there. There was only one way for 250 men to quickly cross the deep river. Sepia asked everyone to please step aside while she built an ice bridge. Hansun was glad to see his teacher and realized that she had come all this way to help them, and despite her persistent pursuit of pacifism and harmony, she was helping them. Sepia said they could now cross the ice bridge. She wished him victory, your grace. Noir asked her to accept his thanks, and Dale turned to Sepia and said, Master, he's leaving. Sepia watched him go with sadness, thinking how strange it was To think a student could make his teacher so worried. Moments later, a hidden squad of Winterguard Rangers ambushed the temporary base. Fire arrows darted straight at the enemy squad, aiming to destroy them. Everything around them erupted in a bright flame, and the ogres were destroyed. One of them screamed loudly, prompting Helmut to announce that the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Cavalry battalions should now form up an attack. They all formed a line and continued the fight. Helmut turned to Hans Sun and asked, "What do you say, young master?" He considered the thought. Since each horse's hooves hit the ground twice per second, they were moving at a speed of at least 40 kilometers per hour. Given the combined weight of the riders and their armor, the force of the impact would be enormous. And when spears 3 to 4 meters long are locked in place, that's the spear formation. Enhanced by the knight's aura, even the orcs won't be able to stop it. Hans Sun commented that the game was completely one-sided, and Noir confirmed his thoughts. This is the point of the cavalry corps, which is the pride of their duchy. Helmut said that he shouldn't relax, young Master Dale, because this is only the beginning. The fight continued, and the ogres advanced on them, shields in hand. Helmut said the ambush had worked, but not enough to destroy them. They would retreat, regroup, and then finish the job with alternating attacks. At that moment, they saw a bright blue light in the sky, and one of the knights shouted the retreat signal. All units must retreat. At that moment, the retreat began, and the orcs watched in bewilderment. They roared loudly, not understanding what was happening, until suddenly they began throwing spears at their enemies. One of the horses was pierced through and roared loudly in pain. A knight fell from his slain mount, and Dale, watching the scene, thought he was unfortunate. Noir reported that one knight had been killed. Hans Sun wondered in disbelief. Did they think he was beyond saving? The proud sword of House Saxe now lay bare before the enemy. Hans Sun turned and asked, "Why are they just watching?" Noir and Helmut exchanged glances, and Hans Sun realized that if he rode there, it would be too late. From this distance, he would need to pierce the orc's tough hide with a single shot. Orc hide is much thicker than that of other monsters, and he would have to modify the Icebot formula. Perhaps adding a precision sniper shell formula would help. Plus, the ballistic trajectory equation for stability. He needed to increase the level of completion. At that moment, he cast a special Icebot spell with a unique formula and directed his powers toward the knight. When he managed to defeat the orc attacking him, Noir was surprised by what was happening. Helmut said the range was considerable, but his accuracy was high. Helmut asked, "Young Master Dale, where is he going?" Dale went to help, and Noir told him to leave him alone. Sir Helmut. Noir realized, to think at his age, he had created an original magic formula. With such a level of destructive power, Dale's inner world must be nearing completion. Dale frowned and realized the other orcs were regrouping. Now he faced two problems. First, his body froze in panic when he fell. Second, his original formula was too long and ineffective for combat. That's why they were studying a simplified formula. He should shorten his own too. For example, a 98 caliber ice magnum. Maybe that's still too long? Well, this one will do. He said, "Ice bullet." And at that moment the knight turned around in fear and saw a bright beam of light pierce the attacking ogre with its tip. The knight asked in confusion, "Young Master Dale, why would he do that for someone like him?" He walked closer to the knight and told him not to worry, as House Saxe would never give up their trusty sword. He placed his hand on his chest, and at that moment, two more monsters appeared behind the knight, approaching, roaring loudly. Dale pointed his hand at them again and used his Shadow Blade skill. The entire area glowed with dark energy, repelling one ogre after another outright. Dale smiled and said, "Destroy them," when suddenly the monster roared even louder, but it was the dark magic that enveloped him as well, one last time. When the head of one of the last ogres fell to the ground, the remaining ogre was frightened and unsure what to do. He saw the bones of his recently deceased friend, and Dale asked, "Is this still here?" At that moment, he used the ice bullet again and declared that it was all over. The knight turned to young Master Dale in confusion and said that his legs were not moving. Dale smiled and said they had done it. He picked up the knight and said they had done it, but he would leave the rest to Uncle Helmut. He dragged the knight to him, and Helmut shouted, "Cavalry, charge! They must attack for the Saxon house and for young Master Dale." All the knights rushed to flee and defend their kingdom. Saxon base sometime later. Knights set up special tents, and guards appeared near the king's special tent. Noir told Dale they'd successfully completed the orc killing mission, and he'd called him because he wanted to ask him something. Why had he rushed behind enemy lines alone? Why on earth would he do something so reckless? Dale didn't know what to say and couldn't understand why he was being scolded now. Noir asked to explain why he had rushed alone behind enemy lines. MC replied, "Yes, father." He said that the knights of House Saxe were the ones he would one day lead. He was simply fulfilling his duty as befits that rank. Noir smiled and said his arguments were unconvincing. Dale looked at him and thought, father was famous for caring for his knights. Why was he acting like this? He frowned and asked, "Should he ask why he stood by and watched his knight die, father?" Noir stood up and said, "The Northern Demon King's territory, under House Saxe, is constantly being attacked by hordes of monsters. Knights who fight on the front lines don't draw their swords in hopes of saving themselves." MC said, "And yet he hoped that he would save a loyal knight, father." Noir asked, "Just like him?" He frowned and spoke, He made those who must think and act to survive on the battlefield believe that someone will save them. He headed towards Dale and asked how many knights with such a mindset would survive. The knights of their territory endlessly sharpen their blades to face the threats that surround them. Only when they reach the limit will he personally stop these threats. This is a noble duty that their house must fulfill. Dale looked down and thought, he is right. This is a logical truth that he cannot refute. Even he knew this in his past life, but somehow he forgot about it. Noir said, but he put his hand on MC's shoulder and said, the way he acted according to his will was quite impressive. He asked Dale to never lose such will of spirit. Dale replied, he understands, father. Noir opened the curtain in the tent and invited him to return to the castle. The story of the Duke's young heir, who charged into an orc horde to save a single wounded knight, quickly became the Empire's favorite gossip. The boys stood on some crates and shouted loudly, and they said the young lord had single-handedly taken down 1,000 orcs. This was mostly true, with a bit of exaggeration. It spread across the Empire like wildfire. Although the man involved in the story considered it embarrassing, the incident injected new energy into the duchy. A few days later, a shout rang out in the training grounds. He had arrived, young Master Dale. The knights knelt before him and said, it is an honor to meet him. Welcome, young Master Dale, MC said, slightly embarrassed. He had told them that there was no need. Helmet smiled and said, be proud, young Master Dale. He raised his fist in the air and shouted, for the sake of young Master Dale's future, they must become even stronger. Do they understand? The knights shouted, yes. MC smiled and thought, they are trying so hard. Eva called out to him and said, young Master Dale, guests from the Orhart house have arrived. Dale thanked Eva, and Helmet asked, isn't it time for them to go, young Master Dale? He thought, it seemed to him they would soon greet a special guest. The Orhart House of Martial Arts. Patriarch Badel, the Divine Sword. He was once a nobleman in the fallen kingdom of Teutonia. But when the Empire began a war of unification, both the kingdom and the Divine Sword perished, and along with them, the Orhart House. After a while, they stood at the door and MC thought, Helmet's expression changed slightly. He was probably remembering the Divine Sword, the man who knighted him. This might be awkward. They entered the hall, and Noir said, just in time. They trained again today, didn't they? Dale replied, yes, father. The butler bowed and said, young Master Dale, the guests have arrived, he said to escort them with respect. A woman with a girl entered the hall, and MC thought it was impressive that she came here without an escort. She bowed and said, she, Vanessa Orhart, humble servant to the Grand Duke of Saxe. MC said, welcome. Vanessa turned around and said, this is her daughter, Charlotte Orhart. She frowned in displeasure and said, mother. Dale wondered what she was trying to do. Charlotte stepped forward and asked why she bowed her head to them. Vanessa shouted, Charlotte, what is she saying? Noir waved his hand and said, she had to go through a lot to come such a long way. He asked, Dale, could he please escort Lady Charlotte around the castle a little? He replied, okay. He extended his hand and asked, Lady Charlotte, could she please? Charlotte slapped his hand and ordered him not to touch her. Dale looked at her puzzled, as did everyone else in the hall. Charlotte looked around and said, shameless imperial nobles. Vanessa screamed, Charlotte, what is she doing? She ordered her to apologize immediately. Charlotte clicked her tongue in displeasure and ran out of the hall. Dale asked Lady Charlotte to wait. He followed her out and slammed the door. Vanessa apologized to them for her daughter's insolence. She's not usually like this, but after recent events, her emotions are unstable. Elena clutched her head and asked, what happened? Vanessa replied, not long ago, Count Brandenburg, the new manager, was appointed to their territory. He is known as the Holy Knight of the Empire, so they must have heard of him. He is as infamous as he is famous, and it's not for nothing that he is called the King of Pigs. They say that in order to produce a very talented heir, he strives to lay his seed in any experienced swordsman, even if that person is her daughter, who has not yet reached adulthood. She barely managed to escape before he could touch her. However, it is impossible to erase that horror from the memory. Elena burst into tears from what she heard, and Noir frowned. Vanessa said she wants to protect her, but as a fallen nobleman, her power is limited. She begs them to please accept her daughter as a servant of House Saxe, so that this man can never lay a hand on her again. At that moment, MC caught up with her and said, Lady Charlotte, does she even know where she is going? Charlotte replied, she doesn't care. Dale thought, why on the training ground? Well, he thinks she is the daughter of a knight. Charlotte asked if his hand is okay. MC replied, everything is fine, no need to worry. Charlotte grabbed the hilt of her sword and said, okay. Dale thought, it looks like she has been crying recently. I wonder if she still thinks about what happened. Even if she acts unfriendly, she is still a child. Charlotte drew her sword from its sheath and said, in that case they should have a duel. Dale of the Saxe house let him draw his sword. MC asked again, what? He thought she just did whatever she wanted. Charlotte ordered him to fight her. MC replied, first he needed a reason. Charlotte said she had heard many rumors about an incredible man who single-handedly killed 1,000 orcs to save a fallen knight. MC smiled and introduced himself. Charlotte said she would defeat him, who was said to have no equal in the Empire, and she would prove to the whole world that she was stronger. Then everyone would understand that she could protect her home from that man. MC asked again, that man? Charlotte replied, Count Brandenburg, the holy warrior. Dale looked at her in surprise, then pursed his lips and thought, he could never forget him. This is the Empire's dog who stabbed him in the back. To think that he heard his name here of all places. He and she have the same goal, so she could be a good ally. But first, she needs a dose of reality. He turned and started to leave, and she looked at him questioningly. He took a blade from the barrel and said, She's just a child who doesn't know anything. Charlotte looked at him in surprise, and MC turned around and told her to attack him with all her strength. Charlotte said that she was already going to do it. She gripped the hilt of the sword and rushed to attack. Dale parried her attack, and Charlotte continued to attack him. MC thought she parried every attack, fending off with flicks of her wrists, and even slightly using aura. She uses this to wield a rapier that is too large for her frame. Just as a mage generates mana through a circle in their heart, a knight accumulates an aura in their body that surpasses human capabilities. She truly is a knight, through and through. Charlotte smirked and, releasing mana through the sword, headed towards MC. He looked at it in surprise and blocked the blow. She thought happily, at this level, the advantage is on his side. When she was born, her father was no longer in this world, but every night her mother told her stories about him. She said that she should protect their home in his place, as the proud daughter of the divine sword. Even when their kingdom fell and their home collapsed, her sword did not slow down. So why does this boy keep stopping it? She looked at Dale and thought, something is wrong. Charlotte screamed and pulled her sword forward. She looked forward in surprise, and MC pushed her sword away. She thought, she is the daughter of the divine sword. Her sword flew back and stuck in the ground. Charlotte fell to the ground and asked why she can't win. MC replied because she is not the divine sword. Her pride as his daughter is valid, but in her current state, she will not be able to protect her home from that man. The sword of a holy warrior is tens of times stronger than his. Charlotte burst into tears and looked up at him. She asked, what should she do then? She stood up and asked what she needed to do. MC replied, Dale of House Saxe, he swears in the name of his family to become the protector of House Orhart. Charlotte was surprised by his words, and Dale said, until the day she becomes strong enough to defeat him herself, he and House Saxe will be her shield. He pulled her sword from the ground and held it out, and Charlotte asked why. MC replied, because her sword was worth it. He asked her to swear to become a sword, for him and for House Saxe. Charlotte wiped away her tears and asked with a smile, how could she refuse this? She knelt before him, took the sword and said she, Charlotte Orhart, swears on her knightly honor. It might have seemed like a simple childish promise, but the determination behind it was strong enough that it could be called a vow. That day in the Duke's office, Noir said that at Lady Orhart's request, Charlotte had become a maid for House Saxe. Unexpectedly, she agreed without hesitation. Did something happen between him and that girl? MC replied, they made a promise, father. In the name of House Saxe, he swore to protect House Orhart. Noir frowned and asked, he didn't say their family's name out of pity, did he? Dale replied, no, father. Noir asked, what did he want? Dale smiled and said, she is the only heir to the divine sword. Her talent is exceptional. They made a new oath together. What he seeks is a new divine sword that will be wielded for the good of their duchy. Noir looked at him in surprise, then smiled and said, okay. MC thought, the last representative of the divine sword's line is now under their roof. This is a great blow to that idiot, Brandenburg. At this time, in Malberg, the capital of Old Teutonia, a loud scream was heard. A nightmare. This arrogant idiot dares to act first? The boy bowed and said, he begs my lord's forgiveness. Brandenburg slammed the table and shouted, idiots! They couldn't even grab one little girl. The boy spoke up. They sent assassins, but they were killed before they reached Saxe's house. They suspect that Charlotte Orhart fought them off herself. Brandenburg frowned and thought, they are useless trash. He exhaled and ran his hand over the scabbard. He thought those were good times. He drew his sword and asked, is it agreed? The holy sword Durandal, his beautiful bride, let her wait for him a little longer. He thought he would find the perfect heir to inherit this after him, no matter the cost. He ordered to contact the Thieves' Guild and send people to the Duke's territory. The boy was surprised, and Brandenburg told him to pay them whatever they asked. He ordered Charlotte, that unfortunate girl, to be brought to him. A week had passed since Charlotte had sworn her allegiance. After settling into the ducal residence, she underwent intensive maid training and made daily sparring with Dale part of her routine. After a while, Helmut asked, so, are they ready? Dale replied, of course. Charlotte frowned, and Helmut said, then, into battle. They rushed forward and crossed their swords. MC quickly dodged and swung his blade. Charlotte tried to fight back, and Helmut watched with fascination. He wondered if this was really a duel between children. They weren't yet on par with knights, but their killing intent and speed were astounding. He watched as Dale quickly moved from place to place. MC looked in surprise at Charlotte, who swung her sword and tried to attack him. Helmut blocked their blows and said, that's excellent work. She did well, Lady Charlotte. She asked to spare her empty compliments. What is she missing, Sir Helmut? She asked. My lady, does she know the essence of the rapier? Charlotte replied. A thrust, is it not? Helmut replied. No, the true essence lies in her footwork. While young Master Dale dodged her blow, he simultaneously closed the distance. At this point, she should have widened the gap and waited for an opening. The more she flexed and straightened her rapier arm, the more her blade trembled, and the less accurate her strike. She would need to rebuild her fundamentals from scratch. Charlotte asked again, what did he say? Helmut replied. He had noticed it for a long time, but her posture and footwork were unrefined and unusual. Charlotte folded her arms across her chest and muttered, Well, she had never had a real teacher before, Helmut said. Now that he was here, he would have to correct her strange fencing. Charlotte blushed with displeasure and screamed, "Is her fencing strange?" Helmut laughed and patted her head, replying, "He's just teasing her, my lady." She looked so cute that he couldn't resist. Dale looked at them carefully and wondered how quickly she would grow under the guidance of Sir Helmut, one of the continent's 7 swordmasters. If he didn't try harder, she might soon catch up with him. The process of creating a mana circle is basically the same. He senses the flow of mana circulating through his heart, waits for it to become stable, and then draws this pattern on his body as a mana ring. The problem is, it can take decades. Sepia asked if he had already completed forming the second circle. MC replied, "Yes, master. In this world, a mage's mana consumption is measured in revolutions per minute. A typical first circle mage makes about 300 revolutions per minute. Currently, the rotation speed of his first circle is 2,000 revolutions per minute, while the rotation speed of his second circle is about 400 revolutions per minute. To expand a new circle, at least 300 revolutions per minute are needed, which means he has already met the requirements for the third circle. Since he has passed the second circle, perhaps he needs to conduct an experiment. He will try to improve the existing ice bullet. He will strengthen the molecular bonds to increase its mass and hardness. Then he will design a large caliber barrel to increase the rotation and speed. An ice bullet, an armor-piercing bullet." He released mana forward and thought, what just happened? Was it always so easy to create an armor-piercing bullet? It seems the influence of the additional circle is so great. Sepia smiled and said, "As always, he learns quickly." MC said, "It's all thanks to her, teacher. He will always be grateful to her." Sepia looked at him carefully and thought, from saving the knight from the orc horde to what happened to Charlotte, he always uses his power for the right reasons. Sometimes he scares her, but he inspires even more confidence. She hugged him and said, "He really is her wonderful student." MC was embarrassed by this and thought, she takes physical contact too easily. This is awkward. That same day in the courtyard of the duchy, MC folded his arms over his chest and thought, she really scared him. Dale said, maybe she really does see him as a child. No, now is not the time for this, he thought. He needs to focus on training. He ordered the ice wall to rise. He used an ice bullet, 12-gauge buckshot, and they bounced off the wall and flew towards him. He created a barrier and protected himself from the bullets. He thought, next time, he will try to adapt it to a bullet. At that moment, a voice rang out. "Dale?" He looked to the side and saw Charlotte, who was looking at him. She said, "So this is where he was practicing." MC replied, "Yes, she too?" Charlotte replied that she was practicing the footwork that Sir Helmut had taught her. MC said, "He thinks she likes learning fencing." Charlotte replied, "Yes, about what happened before." Dale looked at her questioningly, and Charlotte apologized for behaving like that. She was just thinking about how rude she had been to him. "Dale. She means, young Master Dale." MC said, "She really was quite rude." Charlotte widened her eyes at him in surprise, and he smiled and said, "But this time he forgives her." Charlotte smiled and asked, "Really?" Dale answered, "Yes. And also, no need to be so formal with him." Charlotte answered, "Okay." After a while they were standing near a tree and Charlotte was saying she really liked the weather here. She can swing a sword until late at night and the air immediately cools her down. Dale looked at her carefully and answered, "I see." To think that someone else feels the same way as he does. It makes him a little happy. Elena was watching them from the window and saying, "Time flies so fast, doesn't it? Their son is already such an age." Noir placed his hand on her shoulder and asked if they didn't look perfect together. Elena said they'd have to keep an eye on them. Noir said it seemed like everything had already been decided for him. Elena replied that it was a mother's duty to guide her son on the right path so he could be honest about his feelings. Moments later, at the borders of the duchy, the old man thanked Elena. She smiled and said, "Oh no, it's not worth it. Don't forget to take care of your health." MC looked at her and thought, city slums, where the streets are filled with beggars and homeless people. This is where his mother provides assistance. Every week, she delivers food and essentials and helps organize the work. Starting this year, he and Charlotte also began working with her. Charlotte asked the child to wait and asked what happened. The boy grabbed her hand and asked her to help him. His mother, she is in danger. MC looked at what was happening and the boy shouted, "Help her, please." Dale followed them and thought, this is incredibly suspicious. They parted from their night escorts and are walking through a tangled network of alleys. The fact that the request was addressed not to any adult, but to Charlotte arouses suspicion from the very beginning. MC looked up and saw a man. He thought, this man, he is from the Thieves Guild. It seems he was sent by the Holy Warrior. He knew it. After all, their target is Charlotte. The boy said, "One sec. He will get his mother." Charlotte replied, "Okay." The guy came out from behind the corner and said, "Oh my God, what are such precious children doing in such a dangerous place?" Charlotte looked around and saw that they were surrounded. The guy said, "They only have business with the little lady next to him, so he should leave quietly, young master. If they behave inappropriately here, he may get hurt." MC smiled and said, "He, Dale of Saxe, swears to protect Orhart's daughter from thugs like him." The guy said, "His nobility as an aristocrat is truly admirable, although it would be better for them to take into account the time and circumstances. Looks like he'll have to experience some of the pain this world has to offer. Charlotte said, Dale, she forgot her sword. MC said not to be afraid, it's okay. He thought this was the perfect opportunity to try out his new shadow cloak technique under the guise of self-defense. The guys rushed towards them and MC stepped forward. The guys asked, is there a wind? Dale moved and the guy yelled loudly, let them dodge, idiots. MC looked at him and thought, he got it all quickly. He guessed he was a high-ranking thief after all. MC quickly moved and released dark mana and the guy screamed, no, a new shadow cloak technique that Dale discovered after reaching the second circle. By creating shadows like parasites, they move on their own to kill the undead. The guy flew aside and screamed, and their leader frowned and asked, what is he doing? MC created a monster out of the guy, who screamed loudly, he is hungry. He is so hungry. The man spoke in fear. It is the undead. The guy screamed, what is he doing? Let him kill him already. He frowned and thought, whether he was the son of the Saxe Duchy or not, he will die from a simple swing of the blade. He rushed to attack and thought, in these alleys, no one can resist his aura-infused killing technique. He launched small blades towards Dale, who quickly deflected them. The guy thought, nightmare. He jumped up and swung his blade, but Dale activated his double-barreled shotgun and 12-gauge buckshot. It hit the guy's body and created a seal. Charlotte watched what was happening from around the corner and said, Dale? She stepped forward and saw the monster attacking the rest of the guys and the leader was kneeling in front of MC. He exhaled and Dale thought, he thinks the guy won't die from one shot. Aura users are really strong. The guy screamed, he's not dead yet. He rushed to attack again and ordered to die, but at that moment, he was killed. The monster attacked everyone and screamed loudly, he wants to eat. Eat. Dale turned around and said, Charlotte, is she okay? She fell to the ground and answered, yes. The guy screamed loudly, and MC used an ice bullet. He asked to save him, and Dale waved his hand and told him to come back. He walked up to the guy lying on the ground, and he screamed, he will tell him everything he knows. Dale asked again, everything he knew? The guy answered, yes, he would tell him everything. So, MC shot him in the head and said, he wasn't particularly interested. Charlotte looked around and said, this. Dale replied, this is the true face of House Saxe which people fear, and which will protect her. How does she feel being close? Does fear overcome her? Charlotte answered, a little, but it's okay. He fought to protect her, didn't he? After the oath he gave that day, she made her decision. If his house becomes a shield that protects her, then one day she will repay him by becoming the sword that swings for him. Thank him for teaching her what the future means. Charlotte said she will become even stronger. One of the reasons Dale took Charlotte in was because of the guilt over what happened to Sir Bedell 24 years ago. Dale extended his hand to Charlotte and she smiled. That's why Charlotte's decision to become Dale's sword was of much greater significance than Dale himself could have imagined. Meanwhile, at Count Brandenburg's estate, he sat at the table and frowned in irritation. He said, a nightmare. He looked at the head in the box and read the letter where it was written, he knows this will be a difficult visit, Count, but he must invite him to the Duchy of Saxe. He asks him, out of respect for their sincerity, not to refuse this invitation. This is Duke Noir's summons, sent to demand an account. Even a great holy swordsman cannot refuse this order. A few days later, at the Ducal Castle of Saxe, Noir said he is sincerely grateful to him for coming all this way, Count. He did not expect him to arrive so quickly. Please let him forgive such a modest reception. Brandenburg laughed and asked, what could be more urgent than summoning his grace? He frowned and thought, these slippery little rascals. He said, after the commotion at the ducal estate, great unrest is spreading throughout the empire, and attempted kidnapping in the middle of the day. Noir looked at him silently, and Brandenburg said he thought he guessed the reason why he was summoned here. But of course, he, the Emperor's faithful sword, could not be involved in something so shameful, right? Noir put his hand forward and directed his mana towards Brandenburg and his knights. The knights asked, what was this sudden gust of wind? They began to dissolve and cried out, my lord, he begs for mercy. Brandenburg thought fearfully. Even the knights of the Order of St. Magdalene could not resist this magic. Advanced dark magic storm into oblivion. Brandenburg cried out in fear. Your grace, Noir said. On your knees, holy warrior. Brandenburg cried out in irritation. Does he even realize the seriousness of what he's doing now, his grace? Noir advised him to listen carefully. This is the first and last warning. Brandenburg thought, a nightmare. Even though the Dark Duke had his reasons, he didn't expect him to go this far. Noir said, as he knew, he had called him here for peace. But if he dared raise a hand against the children of House Saxe again, he would wipe every member of House Brandenburg from the face of the earth. He asked him to accept his words wholeheartedly. He must be tired from the journey. Why doesn't he rest and warm up? Brandenburg replied, he was grateful for the expressed generosity, his grace, but unfortunately, circumstances prevented him from staying in the duchy any longer. Noir smirked and said, I understand. In that case, he prayed that his return home would be uneventful. Dale thought that what his father had shown to Count Brandenburg, one of the Emperor's most loyal servants, would be the spark that would set the entire empire ablaze. Everything begins with the smallest ember, but it wouldn't take long for the fire to spread. Their duty would be to defeat the Holy Warrior. When the world learned that the Holy Warrior had been forced to kneel before the Dark Duke, the core of the empire would shake. In the Duke's office, Sepia looked around in surprise and said, "This?" Noir replied, "These are the corpses of the Thieves Guild members who attacked Dale." All of this had been done by Dale himself. Corpses torn apart with large holes through them and their entrails spilling out. For the first time, Sepia began to doubt herself. Perhaps her teachings were flawed. Noir said she saw that directing Dale's extraordinary talents in the right direction would require his wisdom. Lady Sepia, he would like to offer him the position of chief rival, Sepia said. In other words, she thought he was asking her not just to remain his mentor, but to become a part of House Saxe itself. Noir said Dale depended on her, Lady Sepia, a lot, but even he couldn't guide him with his own strength. If she supported him, everything would change. Sepia replied she understood him. Learning how this child sees the world was her most important task at the moment. Time passed, and Dale's 10th birthday arrived. Unlike last year's celebration, this time even envoys from the Imperial Court were present. Among them, the most prominent guest was Dale. Dale said, "Welcome, Marquis Julius." He smiled and said, "It is an honor for him, young Master Dale." Some time ago, voices were heard in the hall. "My God, you just have to look at these dishes." As expected of House Saxe, the boy said, "It is such a beautiful sight. It's hard to believe they are in the center of the Northern Territory." The girl laughed and said, she agrees. She feels stupid for always worrying about the duchy being too far from the imperial capital. The central nobility of the imperial capital. The so-called emperor's faction. They form the largest and most influential power block in the empire, called the Emperor. The reason they came to today's banquet is obvious. It is a hidden warning. A message from the imperial family that they will not let any insult to the Holy Warrior go unnoticed. Now the messenger chosen to convey this message unmistakably stands right before him. Julius said, "So, he must be young Master Dale. It is a pleasure to finally meet him." The Crimson Lord, Marquis Julius, is the master of the Red Tower, a man who seeks flame, fury, and power through order. The mages of the Red Tower were infamous for their obsession with strong is righteous during the imperial era, and so they did not hesitate to become the executors of their ambitions. He himself was once subjected to all sorts of modification experiments by the mages of the Red Tower. Julius said, a genius prodigy from House Saxe. He had heard that he possessed an unrivaled talent for magic, unmatched by anyone in the entire empire. Rumor had it that even while defending his family's knights, he single-handedly destroyed a horde of orcs. At 9 years old, no less, as expected of his lordship's son. MC bowed and thanked him for the compliments. He hoped he would enjoy this evening. He went out into the garden and thought every year when his birthday was celebrated like this, he felt as tired as ever. Frankly, he would prefer to train with Charlotte right now, but officially she served as Elena's maid. Besides, if word got out that the daughter of the Divine Sword sparred with him, it could be dangerous for her. Maybe he should practice with his sword alone. A loud scream sounded behind him, making him freeze. Ordered to stand still? Terrible maid. Dale turned around and thought, that scream. Could it really be that? He ran to the side and saw Eva, who was crying and screaming. Please? She's begging him. She serves the Saxe house. The man pounced on her and asked why a simple servant thought she could mention the Duke's name. He grabbed a blade and asked, everyone is busy celebrating his son's birthday, right? Instead of wasting time standing around, it's better to spend it with a woman, right? If she resists again, he will slit her throat. Now let her be a good girl and listen to him. MC yelled in irritation. Is he even aware of his actions? The man froze in fear and said, young master. Eva screamed, young Master Dale. He walked forward and asked what they were doing here. The man asked if he had ever enjoyed the company of a woman before. He was still very young, so he doubted he had such experience. How about he, Petro, personally teach him a thing or two? He grabbed Eve by the neck and held the blade to her neck. He'll show him a good time, she whispered, young master. MC put his hand forward and told her not to worry. He would soon rid her of him. He thought, in this world built on hierarchy, no one could imagine that he would be the one attacking. Dale fired towards Petro and he fell to the ground. He frowned and thought he was not going to retreat since challenging the Emperor's people was not the smartest thing to do. Petro stood up and shouted, what is he doing, young Master Dale? MC ordered him to kneel. Petro asked again, what? MC shouted. Did he not hear? He ordered him to kneel and apologize to Miss Eva. As she said, she serves in their house. She is one of the members of the Saxe house. Petro thought irritably, this little brat from Saxe. He said, young Master Dale, to his regret, he stands here today as the representative of His Majesty himself. Insulting him by defending the honor of a lowborn girl is tantamount to insulting the Emperor. Dale asked him to tell me, does His Majesty enjoy harassing servants from noble houses for fun? Petro asked again, excuse me, how dare he say such a thing? Noir, Elena, and Julius approached them and MC said, this is his last warning, on his knees. Julius said, aha, what an interesting turn of events. Noir screamed, Dale, what is going on here? He replied, this man attempted to use violence against one of the servants of House Saxe. Noir screamed, and for this he showed such disrespect to Lord Petro? Petro cried out, yes, your grace. The young master was acting recklessly. Dale stretched out his hand and screamed, who asked him to stand up? Their honored guests from the imperial capital have been entrusted with the great duty of acting in His Majesty's stead, and yet This man attempted to defame a common servant, tarnishing His Majesty's name in the process. Therefore, he could not stand by and allow Lord Petro's shameful behavior to go unpunished. Julius laughed and said, "Well, what a clever young man. Indeed, he speaks the truth. Who would have thought that the one entrusted with His Majesty's will would stoop so low as to attack a girl of low birth?" Petro asked in surprise. "Lord Julius?" Julius released a fiery mana and commanded him to burn the filthy insect. Petro started to run and screamed. "No." He said goodbye, and Julius unleashed a stream of fire in his direction. Petro screamed loudly, "It hurts. It hurts so much." Julius said, "Everything they said is true. His duty is to destroy the worms who dare to insult the Empire and the Imperial family. He sincerely wishes him success, young Master Dale." The excitement subsided, the Emperor's men left, and peace reigned in the Sax house. After that, in the morning, Eva entered the room and said, "Young Master, it's time to wake up." MC rubbed his eyes and hummed in response. He thanked her for waking him up. Eva replied, "That's nonsense." Dale asked if she wanted to say something. Eva replied, "Well, thank you. It's a great honor for her that someone like her can serve him." MC looked at her carefully and wondered if that was all she dared to say. He had lived in 2 different worlds, but he was still unfamiliar with this feeling. He would have to get used to it. He smiled and thanked Eva. He thought, as the eldest son of the Sax house, he understood the significance of this name, and he would use it however he could. "If it helps destroy the Empire," Noir said after a while. "He's smart, Dale, but he's been acting strange lately. Is there a reason for that?" MC was thoughtful for a moment, then replied, "If the hero from another world hadn't died in the battle with the divine sword Beidel, then the next place the hero's sword would most likely have appeared was the Saxe Duchy." Noir looked at him in surprise and said, "That's a bold statement. Where does he get such confidence?" MC replied, "Because." He thought about it. In his past life, he heard that the Empire was plotting against the Saxe house. The Empire abandoned the hero. They were afraid of what might happen if the leash their hound was on broke and attacked its master. Dale said, "Even though the hero from another world defeated the Demon King, the Empire didn't eradicate the darkness from the Demon King's domain. Instead, they issued an absurd order to seize the Demon King's lands, expand the Empire's territory, and unilaterally demanded sacrifices from their house. They even gifted the land to him. Until the darkness in this land is completely dispelled, the bloodshed will not cease." Noir listened intently, and MC continued. "Moreover, people within the Empire and beyond its northern borders are pointing to them, House Saxe, as a clan of darkness. Just as they abandoned the hero, they will try to eliminate the internal risks, meaning those who could threaten them from within." Noir asked again, "Did they betray the hero? Where is he from?" Dale replied, "These are merely conclusions and inferences he made based on the records he read. It's perfectly logical. Officially, the hero accepted an honorable death after a brutal battle with the Divine Sword battle. Noir thought it was only natural that he would be surprised. After all, only a few know the truth about the hero's death." MC said that if his theory was correct, then the Empire was simply an oppressor who took over weak countries by force. Noir looked at MC carefully and thought, "This child is wise beyond his years." He asked, "So what does he think House Saxe should do to move forward?" Dale replied that House Saxe could never coexist with the Empire. Therefore, they must destroy the Empire. Noir's eyes widened in surprise and his expression darkened. He asked, "Dale, does he even understand what he's proposing?" MC replied, "He's not saying they should immediately raise an army and rebel in 10 years. Noir asked again, "10 years? MC replied, "Even now, resistance groups on every continent are seeking independence. There are vassals like him, Duke Saxe, who fear the Empire will turn its blade against them. The economy is shrinking, banditry is growing every day, and although the unification of the 7 continents is over, the effects of the war have only worsened. By then, they will gather forces to defend their home from the Empire. They will support resistance forces operating in various regions," and he presented his plan for the fall of the Empire, and they discussed it until sunset. Dale asked what he was thinking about. Noir grinned and said, "His talents truly know no bounds. He sees things that even he doesn't. He is so proud that he is his son. From this day forward, he will no longer be just the Duke's eldest son and a mere 10-year-old. He will treat him as his heir, the boy who will one day lead House Saxe." MC said in surprise, "Father." Noir patted him on the shoulder and said, "As the head of the family, he will listen to his words and respect them." Dale thought he'd been waiting for this day when he would finally receive the authority to rule House Saxe with his own hands. Noir told Dale to speak without hesitation. What decision would he make regarding their family at this point? MC asked. He said he would treat him differently. Right, father? If so, then let him grant him permission to go to the Tower Challenge in Necropolis. Noir looked at him questioningly. The Tower Challenge is a kind of game in which one must determine one's rank among mages, where they will meet the Guardians of the Magic Tower. Defeating higher-ranking Guardians increases their status, and the strongest among them will receive the title of Tower Elder. The one who reaches the very top receives the title of Magic Tower Master. Noir asked if he really wanted to go to such a dangerous place where he could lose his life. It was too early for him. He hadn't even passed his 3rd circle yet. Dale replied that he would soon. Noir spoke up. Usually, one can only pass the 3rd circle between the ages of 20 and 30. Even for someone like him, who had already passed his 2nd circle, it won't be easy. Dale said that this decision concerns both him and House Saxe. Noir asked why. MC replied that if he proved his worth in the test, his status as his heir would strengthen his position, and he would gain a reputation worthy of trust. not one built on rumors spread by gossips. Noir asked, is that why he wants to take the tower test? MC replied, yes. Noir smiled and replied, all right, he leaves this matter to him. Dale happily thanked him and said that he would prove it to his father. A few days later, in the city of death, Necropolis, the mages looked towards the arriving carriage and said, they thought they had finally arrived. They bowed and cried out, they humbly come before the Dark Duke. Dale got out of the carriage and yawned, his mouth wide open. He looked at the mages and wondered if he had overdone it again this time. Someone spoke. It was Duke Sax. Young Master Dale is with him. They laughed and said, they say he is a genius, unparalleled in the Empire. Is that true? The guy said, although he does not look very well today. The other told him not to doubt it. He heard that he wields a sword on par with the knights of the ducal court. Velik smirked and said, what nonsense. He, Velik, is the best graduate of the academy, the one destined to win this test in the tower. The guy said, this noble boy looks like he will fall if he even touches him. Eris bowed and said, they pay their respects to the tower master. Noir said, they have not seen each other for a long time, Eris. She replied, it is an honor to serve him, young Master Dale. Eris, she's the elder of the tower, the secretary general, performing all administrative duties in the absence of the Dark Duke. Noir said, when the test begins, she will assist Dale. He replied, yes, father. He will be in her care, Eris. She replied, yes, young master. This way, please. 59 academy graduates are waiting for him. All of them will undergo the test with him. She opened the door and said, these are the participants who will undergo the tower test. Dale looked around, and after a while, Eris said, she welcomes everyone gathered here. She is Eris, the elder of the Balni and the secretary general overseeing the activities of this Balni. She will now explain the first test of the Tower of Dark Magic. Please have them check the necklace around their necks. This is the necklace of life. This is a battle royale style test, a battle for life points. Each necklace contains a defensive spell that will protect them and 1 life point. When they land a correct hit on the enemy using the corpses scattered across the battlefield, the enemy's necklace activates its defensive spell and shatters, signifying destruction. The attacker who lands the correct hit gains 1 life point to their necklace. The participant whose total score reaches +3 points will advance to the next floor. Finally, anyone using artifacts will be disqualified for cheating. MC looked at the necklace and thought, so these are the rules. It's a quick and effective way to weed out newbies. But still, Velik pointed his finger at MC and said, this is a monster. How is it that at such a young age he is already a third circle mage? Like he said, they must destroy this monster first. The guy asked if they were even allowed to attack him. Velik said not to worry. From the moment they entered this place, they had become competitors. Dale thought, well, at least he had confidence in himself. They would see if his abilities could back up his talk. Eris screamed, the test begins. Everyone quickly put their seals forward and began raising corpses. Everyone aimed at MC, and when the zombie swung his sword, Dale quickly blocked his attack. Behind him stood a large zombie, crossing his arms above his head. Someone screamed, when did he have time? Dale released his mana and froze the zombie, and the guy screamed, it's water magic. He just asked not to tell him that this guy is a mage of 2 elements. The zombie MC rushed to attack, and the guy screamed, he dares to touch his soldiers? He tried to attack him, but nothing happened. MC said, it's useless. He protected them with ice armor. He attacked again, and Velik screamed, using water magic is considered a violation of the rules, isn't it? Only necromancy and magic that controls the undead are allowed. All other forms of enhancement are prohibited. MC replied, okay, but there's no rule that says he can only enhance the undead with dark magic, right? Eris remained silent, and Dale said, judging by the fact that the test was not suspended, it looks like he is right. Velik frowned with displeasure and ordered the monsters to block the corpses and aim directly at MC. The zombies headed toward Dale, and Velik shouted, they'll overwhelm him with sheer numbers. MC thought, come to think of it, using artifacts was also forbidden. In that case, this was the only way. Dale rushed to the other side, where the zombies with weapons stood. He began to dodge the attack, then grabbed the sword and cried out, he's caught. Dale snatched the sword and struck the monster with his fist. He swung the sword and killed the monster. The guy asked in surprise, amazing, his undead were killed so easily? Velik said with displeasure, this isn't an ordinary sword. He reforged the bones to increase the sword's durability. Dale reshaped the sword and walked toward the other zombies. The monster slammed the weapon on the ground, and MC jumped and swung the sword. He cried out and quickly dealt with the undead. Velik said in fear, he even defeated his last dead soldier. A mage shouldn't be so skilled with a sword. MC gripped the sword and walked towards the boy. He fearfully asked to wait. Young Master Dale, he's giving up. MC said, what's wrong? He's not really going to die. He swung his sword and hit him on the head, and Velik screamed, he's a monster. Eris said, the results are in. Young Master Dale passes alone with 60 hit points. He thought, let them watch carefully. This will be his first step forward. To pass the second floor of the tower's test, the task is to defeat a guardian creature known as a flesh golem. Usually, surviving candidates from the first floor cooperate with each other, but MC eliminated them all. The huge monster swung its hand, and Dale thought, unlike the rules of the first floor, all forms of magic are now allowed. Although the rule, no artifacts, still applies, it's more than enough for him. The golem extended its hand forward, and Dale released his dark mana, thinking this was the perfect opportunity to test the limits of his third circle. The golem slammed its fist onto the floor, sending rocks flying in all directions. It roared, then suddenly looked toward its hand. MC was releasing mana toward the enemy, accelerated decay. Noir watched and spoke. Eris interrupted him, saying, "Young Master Dale's magic is unusual. Why did he choose to leave the monster to rot instead of destroying it outright?" Dale thought that in his past life, when he faced monsters, this strategy was just as important as firepower. It was called biochemical warfare. MC covered his nose and thought about how it stunk. He wondered if they even realized that what they were witnessing was a grotesque process of biochemical warfare, now expressed through dark magic. That day, Dale successfully passed the test, climbing to the 10th floor, setting a new record. He was then given 4 days of rest before the 11th floor test. Meanwhile, in order to recover from the unprecedented carnage on the first floor, 59 other participants were allowed to take the test again. Except for Dale, of course. That same evening after the test, MC was standing near the fountain. Sepia called out to Dale and said he performed magnificently. MC cried out, "Teacher, it's all thanks to her teachings, teacher." Sepia said she was proud to hear that from him. Dale turned to teacher Sepia and asked if she would like to go on a date with him. She widened her eyes in surprise and asked again, "On a date?" Dale said, "The town festival is going on right now. They should go." Sepia replied, "Well, okay then. They will go." She thought for a moment. A date? Well, technically he's not wrong, and yet Dale must be misunderstanding what a date actually is. MC thought happily, is this what people mean when they say someone is dark inside? There were a lot of people at the Necropolis Town Festival. Sepia said, he must be tired after such a difficult challenge. MC said he's fine. Besides, there are still a few days left before the next challenge starts. Sepia said, I see. She's glad to hear that. They walked forward in silence, and after a while, MC asked, the moon is beautiful, isn't it? Sepia fixed her hair and replied, yes, it really is. MC thought, the conversation isn't flowing as easily as before, but this silence doesn't feel uncomfortable. It's always been like this with Sepia. Maybe it's because she believed in him from the start, but he finds himself wanting to get closer to her. A few days ago, on the day he passed his third circle, he finally understood what Sepia meant. Facing the inner world, Dale was covered in mana, and blood began pouring from his nose. He grabbed his nose and chest and then thought, to surpass his limits, he must overfill his mana reserve beyond the second circle. Only by withstanding the raging mana can he reach his third circle. 3 magical seals appeared, and a sword pierced his body. He thought, this dark sword. Dale looked around and saw a snow-covered expanse. He said, this place. He thought, when a person immerses himself in deep meditation, an inner world inevitably manifests. So this is it. This is his inner world, his world of awareness. From the very beginning, there was nothing here, only absolute emptiness. MC thought, and in this empty world, Master Sepia extended her hand to him. Maybe that's why. Sepia asked Dale. He thought, she is the one who brings light to his world. He said, teacher, he likes her. Sepia widened her eyes in confusion and asked again, what did he just say? MC answered, he said he liked her. Teacher Sepia. She smiled and hugged him. She said, I see. She really likes him too, Dale. He thanked her and thought, reliving certainly has its perks. A few days later, the tower test began, the 11th floor. MC thought he hadn't succeeded with Sepia. She probably dismissed it as the childish impulse of a 10-year-old boy. For now, he will focus on the exam. Eris held out her hand and said, the format of this test is a one-on-one magic duel. The winner advances to the 12th floor. The master of the third circle, Albert Rosenheim, said, it is an honor to meet him, young Master Dale. Don't expect him to be lenient towards him, just because he is a child. The trial of the 11th floor allows the use of all kinds of artifacts and magical strategies. This means that the necklace of life cannot guarantee his safety. The restrictions on the use of artifacts are lifted. He does not need to hold back. He will crush him completely and show him the difference in power. Albert released mana towards him and said, let the duel proceed. He laughed loudly and said, he better be on his guard. He is not like those new academy graduates they have encountered before. This is where his streak ends. He created large energy seals and offered to see if he can block it. Arrows began to attack MC, but he deftly dodged them. Dale thought, even if it was only for a moment, using an attack spell before the duel began is a clear violation. However, the judges didn't give any sign or signal to stop the match. They must be curious to see how strong he really is. This is pure meritocracy. That's why he hates magicians. Albert ordered a rebellion. His creations? Let them swear eternal service to him. Zombies appeared in front of him and walked towards MC. Albert screamed. His servants, born from the darkness deeper than the bloodthirsty night. MC thought how embarrassing. Where did he even learn such a ridiculous performance? However, he is definitely stronger than an ordinary beginner. He began to dodge the attacks again, and Albert mockingly asked, how long is he going to dodge? He can't win just by avoiding him. The zombies walked towards MC, and he quickly attacked them and threw them in different directions. He asked, he has nothing else to show, right? He used a deadly explosion and the monster's body exploded. Albert shouted, he will be today's winner, young Master Dale. He widened his eyes in surprise and asked to wait. When did he have time? Where is he? MC asked, isn't it a low act to deceive a child? Albert started looking around and asked where he disappeared to. Dark streams of mana enveloped Dale, who moved behind him, and said, he looks a little worried. It was a clever sneak attack, but it was clearly not enough to defeat him. He used shadow transformation. Dark tentacles grabbed Albert's legs and a voice rang out, he's hungry. He's hungry. Can he eat him? Can he? He'll ask to let him eat already. A huge dark dragon appeared in front of Albert, and Dale said, okay, but don't overeat. Everyone looked at what was happening in fear, and Albert screamed loudly. The tentacles grabbed his body and someone screamed. No, Dale said. It seems they got a little hot from hunger. Albert asked for mercy. MC said, back. The tentacles released Albert and a voice rang out. The winner of the first round, Dale, he said. So, who's ready for the second round? All the mages who stood by said they gave up and just wanted to live. From the third round onward, all the duels except the final one ended in victory by default. Dale continued to refine and form his 3 magic circles. As he began to break through the guardians of each floor, by the time he reached the 20th floor, a worthy opponent finally appeared. The Headless Horseman, a knight with nothing in place of his head. Someone said, a headless knight, created by one of the elders of the Dark Tower himself. This is an opponent unlike any that have come before. Even for him, young Master Dale, this may be the highest achievement he is capable of. MC wondered if it would be boring if everything went as expected. He released dark mana and directed it towards the enemy. The guy asked, what's going on? Let him look over there. The rider knelt down, and someone screamed, a headless knight is kneeling. MC looked at it carefully and frowned, and then struck him with his sword and told him to end his torment. The rider fell and began to dissolve. Dale thought, such devotion that he even abandons his duties as a guard. He looked around and thought, maybe he went a little overboard. He supposes it is only natural to be shocked. He means that the creation betrayed its creator and swore allegiance to him. This proves that he has reached a level equal to that of the Elder of the Dark Tower. He didn't intend to go this far. He has already proven himself enough. Should he go back? He walked to the side, and someone asked where he was going. This is the exit, isn't it? Why is he going back? MC thought, even if he could climb higher, there was a line he must not cross. Beyond this level lay a realm feared even by monsters, something truly unknown. And thus, Dale's trial came to an end, as did the tower's trial. A cry rang out. The master of the magic tower had arrived. The entire Dark Tower rose in unison, as if at a military parade. Nobles and elders alike demonstrated their devotion. Every tower mage paid their respects to father and son. Thanks to Dale's stunning performance, the northern territories began to unite under their banner. The north of the empire, the Duchy of Saxony. Knights destroyed goblins one after another. One of them was incredibly confident, swinging his sword so fast that the goblins had no time to escape. The knights did this for the young Lord Dale, for the House of Saxony, and shouted about it. After successfully completing the tower test, Duke Noir appointed Dale commander of a squad to destroy the orc horde. The protagonist assisted his subordinates. It was a task too difficult for a 10-year-old child, but Dale raised his sword and rejoiced in his victory over the goblins. Despite this, no one doubted his competence as a commander. Thus, as the legitimate heir of the Dark Duke, he gradually began to unite the North. Sometime later, Dale arrived to Duke Noir and reported that they had killed 145 Urok. Noir asked again what the cavalry's losses were. He replied that 3 had received minor wounds, but otherwise, nothing. Noir asked, did he use magic to protect them? Dale turned away and replied, no, it was solely thanks to the sword of the House of Saxon. Noir smiled and praised his son. Dale smiled back, and at that moment, Uncle Helmut joined their conversation, turning to Noir and saying, Your Grace, it seems young Master Dale has already mastered command of large cavalry units. Dale added that this was all thanks to Sir Helmut's instruction. He realized that Sir Helmut had taught him swordsmanship, tactics, and military strategy. Helmut continued to say that at this rate, he would soon be waging full-scale territorial wars. Dale clutched his head, then confidently thought, yes, territorial wars. He always welcomed the next stage. Sometime later, Charlotte fought Dale and screamed loudly. A serious battle was taking place between them, and she was aiming to attack him. Suddenly, that sharp sword was right next to Dale's face, causing him to panic and roll back. But he easily and deftly avoided the blow and looked at his opponent with a smirk. Their swords clashed again and again, continuing to fight equally. A moment later, the sword was near Dale's throat again, and he muttered in surprise that she had become much better. Charlotte looked at him sadly, then said that he knew she couldn't compare to him. He chuckled and asked again, had he teased her too much? She replied, well, he's already a 3rd circle mage and has reached the 20th floor of the tower. Since then, everyone addresses him as Young Master Dale, and so on. Aren't they tired of it? Dale asked her not to worry. She will get stronger too, Charlotte. Considering she's only 10 years old, she's already exceptional by any standard. Charlotte got angry when he said that and blushed, frowning. After that, she started yelling at him to stop talking to her like a child. Dale replied that she was a child, and Charlotte pointed her finger at him and yelled that he was a child too. He pointed at himself and asked again, him? Actually, he was already an adult. Charlotte told him to just move on. After some time, the protagonist was already in his quarters, opposite Uncle Helmut, who decided to hold a new lesson today. This lesson was dedicated to the hammer and anvil tactics. He demonstrated various methods using chess pieces on the table. In battle, when cavalry forces are engaged on one or both flanks, the cavalry's task is to break through the enemy's flanks and encircle them. Meanwhile, the infantry blocks the enemy cavalry's advance. The hammer and anvil tactics are so named because it is like placing iron on an anvil and hitting it with a hammer. This tactic relies heavily on cavalry. Dale wondered if this was truly possible only thanks to the Black Cavalry. Warfare patterns are similar in every world. At this point, he replied, by the way, how's Charlotte's training going? He pondered Charlotte's progress. Although she can't compare to him, she's truly doing remarkably well. She's already grasped her basic swordsmanship, and soon she will officially inherit the aura development and swordsmanship of House Saxe. However, there's one cause for concern. Dale asked again. Is Charlotte's compatibility with their swordsmanship style? While mages transform mana into magic with their heart circles, knights transform aura mana with their cultivation methods. Mages build magical towers by mastering structure, while knights reform orders by passing on their swordsmanship techniques. Among them, the Black Cavalry of the North resemble war chariots. The power of the Night Raven Knights of House Saxe clearly demonstrates that the Northern Knights specialize in disrupting the battlefield with brute force. The problem is that Charlotte's swordsmanship relies on speed and fluidity. She wields a swift, free-flying sword. Given her talents, she could possibly reach the lowest rank of the 7 sword masters, but she will never become the first sword. The pinnacle of the 7 swords is the position her father once held. Dale uttered, "Sword of Blossom, if only this swordsmanship still existed." Helmut frowned with disappointment, then said that, however, it had been completely lost after the fall of the knightly nation. Dale wondered if it could truly vanish from this world forever. After that, Dale's days became even more ruthless. As he combined monster subjugation with his studies, his reputation continued to grow steadily. The time had come to demonstrate the results of his progress. Noir frowned in horror and asked what he had just said. A subordinate approached him and continued to explain that a neighboring territory ruled by Baron Parker had declared a territorial war, demanding ownership of a copper mine belonging to him. In this world, the boundaries between countries and peoples were far less clear than one might think. However, a low-ranking nobleman engaging in a high-ranking nobleman's fight was absurd. His subordinate informed him that if he refused to vacate the mine and accept the challenge, Count Brandenburg would be reported as siding with the Baron to maintain his peace. Moreover, a letter had arrived proposing the deployment of the Knight St. Magdalene in exchange for a share of the mine's profits. At that moment, Dale and Noir were simultaneously dumbfounded. It became clear to him how they intended to proceed. He still hadn't forgotten the humiliation he'd suffered that day at the hands of his father. If this were to continue, Dale would respond in kind. Did Count Brandenburg really intend to continue in this vein? From that day on, he must have been thinking only about how to repay the humiliation he suffered at the hands of the Dark Duke. But it would be difficult for him to openly start a territorial war, so he decided to settle the matter in a border region where his presence would be controversial. He was just a pathetic worm. At that moment, Dale turned to his father and announced that he would personally command this battle along with the Knights of House Saxe. Noir snapped. No, it was too early for him to take this on himself. He must refrain from rash statements. War against humans is completely different from exterminating monsters. Noir turned to Baron Grinbelt and asked him not to worry, as he would personally guard his mine. Grinbelt thanked him for these words, and Dale was greatly upset by his father's distrust. When he arrived in his room, he turned to his uncle and sighed sadly, saying that he knew better than anyone that he could do this. Why wouldn't his father listen to him? Helmut asked him not to pay too much attention to the Duke's words, as he must be disappointed, but he certainly had his reasons. Dale didn't know what to say, and Helmut said that in any case, he had something prepared for him. At that moment, he looked to the side and asked, "How about playing a strategy game with him?" Dale realized that this game was similar to chess, but here it was called something else. He asked, "A war game?" Helmut was glad that he knew about it. This game was very similar to real war, so the rules here were complex. But once he got the hang of it, they would be very useful. If he played against him, they could have a serious discussion about the battlefield. At that moment, Dale snatched the chessboard from his hands and, holding it above himself, exclaimed, "That's it." Helmut asked again, "Young sir, where are you going?" The protagonist ran to his father, who asked what he wanted. If he beat him in this strategy game, did he want permission to join the territorial war? He didn't change his mind even after hearing what he had to say. Dale replied that he understood that war wasn't just a clash of forces but a serious contest of wits. Please, let him appreciate him one match at a time. Helmut laughed and apologized to the Duke, saying he would talk to him. Noir responded sharply, "No, let him leave it here." Dale was as surprised as Helmut, and Noir continued to say that if he won, he would grant his wish. Dale was overjoyed and thanked his father for believing in him. His father replied that if he lost, he would abandon the idea of participating in this battle. After some time, their battle continued. Helmut's mouth dropped open in astonishment, and he said, "Oh my." It turned out that this was indeed his victory. Despite Duke Noir's caution, young Master Dale took advantage of his superior numbers and favorable terrain. He still couldn't believe that Dale had won 2 out of 3 matches against the Duke himself. Dale asked, "So he'll keep his promise, right?" Noir was shocked but replied, "Okay, but since when did he know this game?" He scratched his head and replied that several years ago he found a collection in the library, played it, and began studying it. Of course, it was a lie, and if he hadn't somehow spun it, he would have seemed too strange. Noir rose from his seat and said that a promise was a promise. In his name, he was giving him full command of the knights in the upcoming battle. Helmut was shocked and shouted, "Your Grace." Noir ignored him and said that no matter how high his expectations were, the honor of House Saxe was at stake. Defeat would not be accepted. He asked for the last time, could he really handle this battle alone? Dale grinned and replied, "Yes, please, let his father trust him. He would prove he could do it," placing his hand on his heart. Noir smiled and replied that that was very good. Let him prove what he had sought and return victorious. Sometime later, in the Brandenburg fortress, Malberg, Brandenburg shouted, He's been drinking and wandering through the slums all day again, Philip. Rumor has it that the young scion of House Saxe will personally lead his knights. What is he even doing? Philip replied that his father shouldn't worry. He's just a 10-year-old brat. He is the eldest son of Count Brandenburg. Philip then turned to his father and said that, as his eldest son, he begs him to allow him to crush the arrogant brat of House Saxe along with his knights. Brandenburg became extremely angry and clenched his teeth in rage, then slammed his fist on the table with such a bang that Philip flinched in fear. Brandenburg asked again, was he calling him just a 10-year-old brat? Philip didn't understand, and Brandenburg continued shouting, arrogant brat of House Saxe? He's just a monster he couldn't handle even in 100 years. Philip fell to the floor in fear and spilled the bottle of alcoholic drink he was holding. Brandenburg called him a pathetic insect, inferior even to a 10-year-old. He knew he should have taken care of Charlotte long ago. In this battle, he entrusted him with command of their knights. Philip smiled and replied, yes, father. Brandenburg asked again, what was he so happy about? His job was simply to stand there and look handsome, nothing more. Philip asked again, what did he mean? He replied that Sir Milvus would be in actual command. His job was simply to be the figurehead of the army. That would be enough. Then he turned to Sir Milvus and asked him to take Philip away from here. Milvus grabbed him by the shoulders and dragged him along, while Philip cried out in fear, father. Brandenburg turned and thought that he himself wanted to go onto the battlefield, but he couldn't go against a child. And don't let him say that this was part of his plan, Duke Noir. A few days later, on Baron Grinbelt's territory, he sat, frightened, awaiting the unknown. Beads of sweat trickled down his face as he stared ahead. When the protagonist appeared before him, they shouted out a respectful greeting to young Lord Dale of House Saxe. They thanked him for coming so far. The knights began discussing among themselves. Is he really just a child? Does he even know how to wield a sword? They really do call him a prodigy, so one of them suggests not to worry about it. Grinbelt's face showed disbelief and fear, but he approached Dale and said that with them, young lord, they feel more confident and truly relieved. Dale thanked him for these words, and at that moment, Grinbelt thought with fear, did they really send a 10-year-old boy? Even considering that he is accompanied by the Black Cavalry, entrusting complete command to such a young man is too much. In the meantime, please let them come inside and attend the banquet they have prepared. But Dale replied that they do not have much time. Grinbelt asked fearfully, what did he mean? At that moment, Dale abruptly thrust his sword in front of him and declared that, first, he wanted to inspect the condition of the troops under his command. Among the soldiers he commanded, who was the strongest? Grinbelt was dumbfounded by this, and Dale decided to ask again, who was the strongest of those under his command? At that moment, one of the knights announced that it was he, young lord. No one could match him. It was a knight with red hair and confident features. He wondered if this little brat was hanging around here with his sword at the ready, only because his family had paid for everything. He would definitely put him in his place. The protagonist frowned and looked him in the eyes silently. He removed the sword from Grinbelt, who stuttered fearfully and said mockingly that he seemed to doubt his abilities. It's all because he's a 10-year-old boy, put in charge of a squad without any prior discussion. Right? At that moment, he slammed his sword on the ground and declared that he, too, had every right to doubt them. But there was a surefire way to dispel their doubts with a sword. However, he was perplexed by the fact that the so-called strongest knight he was boasting about was very drunk. Therefore, there was no need to test his competence. He had personally confirmed his doubts. Or is drinking necessary for courage? Enraged by this humiliation, he drew his sword and said, very well, young sir, before aiming it at Dale's chest. He stated his name and declared that he would defend his knightly honor with the steel of the Baron's sword. The protagonist looked at him with a smile, and a moment later they found themselves on the battlefield. Dale stood confidently before his opponent and asked, he's heard of his sword, right? Harback clutched his head and laughed at his words, then spoke up. But of course, the infamous special sword. Dale wondered where his confidence came from. Did he really have an ace up his sleeve? At that moment, Harback shouted that he would attack him immediately. When he deftly and sharply advanced, Dale easily parried his attack, and his sword collided with his hand. Dark magic emanated from the protagonist's hand, and Harback was dumbfounded. A moment later, the protagonist had dealt so many blows that he was forced to retreat. Dale grinned and thought that he couldn't even infuse aura into the blow. However, using an aura blade is only available to a small fraction of the elite, and yet, he was giving it his all. He should reciprocate. At that moment, Dale straightened up and created a magical seal in his hand, from which even more magical power emanated. Harback was frightened and screamed, what is this? Dark magical forces began to approach him from the ground, attacking him. He froze. Gritting his teeth in anger, he began swinging his sword to defend himself, but it was no use. He realized Dale was attacking, and the artifact was making it impossible for him to concentrate. Their battle continued while Dale stood firm and steadfast. He mused that, in terms of skill, he wasn't all that impressive. Suddenly, something alerted him, and Dale looked ahead questioningly. Harback fell to the ground, clutching his chest, when other knights suddenly ran up to him and asked if he was all right. The protagonist was in shock at what he saw. He couldn't understand. Had he really fallen? Was he really that easy to defeat? Harback was helped up, and at that moment, Grinbelt shouted, "Young Master Dale, what are you doing? He's disabled one of their best knights right before an important battle." Dale grew angry and said, "Baron Grinbelt, does he not understand the situation? With such pathetic knights, he will only be a liability in the coming battle. Or did he plan to sit on the sidelines while House Saxe did all the dirty work?" Grinbelt was dumbfounded by what he heard and asked again, "What?" Dale continued asking questions. Was this man really the strongest warrior of their order? Harbach lowered his gaze, ashamed, unable to answer. Dale confidently declared that House Saxe would always defend an ally without hesitation, but that did not mean they could neglect their duties. Therefore, for now, their knights would act as their swords, and now they must choose, obey him or lose their support. A moment later, all the knights bowed to him and knelt before Dale. They shouted their oath of allegiance to him. Night fell some time later. Alina lay in bed, in tears. Noir approached her, wiped the tears from her face, and said there was no need to worry. This child exceeded all his expectations. He was sure that when he grew up, he would achieve unimaginable heights. Elena continued to lie there, not answering her husband. Noir stood and smiled, saying that one day their son would lead this world itself. Meanwhile, the protagonist clutched his head and realized that everything was hopeless. He had lived like a frog in a well, and was only now beginning to realize how pathetic the world beyond it was. All around him were incompetents, every single one. It was no wonder the Holy Sword decided to invade this territory. He surely knew the truth about Grinbelt. Well, in that case, he had a plan. The next day, the weather was fine, and Harbach was dragging a heavy load behind him. It was a huge stone he was dragging with ropes, and suddenly fell to the ground. The knights around him shouted that it was too early for him to collapse. He must rise now, weakling. Did he really dare call himself a knight from the north? Dale, sitting nearby on a throne, watched everything unfold. Harbach shouted that he was wounded, and Dale kept saying that he hadn't done anything properly and was already whining. He turned to Bale and told Baron Grinbelt to train the knights in everything, starting with endurance training, as they were good for nothing. Baron listened to the order and set to work. Dale also asked that someone be sent to Baron Parker to tell them they would like to propose negotiations. The knight repeated the question. "Negotiations?" Dale confidently replied, yes, he shouldn't be afraid, as he had no intention of accepting humiliating truce terms. He simply wanted to see someone before the battle. Sometime later, the men arrived at the negotiation site, on the border between two baronies. Dale sat alone at the table, waiting for his partner. He understood they had a couple of weeks left, tops. Considering the Knights of St. Magdalene had embarked on a long campaign across the continent, their meager supplies would likely strike first. Parker's defense force couldn't be underestimated. The protagonist's subordinate reported that Lord Philip had arrived. Dale glanced at him with a smirk and thought that, as expected, they had sent these two. This pawn, Commander Philip, had even powdered himself to come out to him. Philip grinned at him, causing Dale to wonder if Sir Milvus, the real commander of the battle, was standing behind him. The protagonist greeted Lord Philip, who sat down at the negotiating table with a sneer and asked, "Does he want to negotiate? After all, real war is no place for weaklings." Dale smiled silently, looking at him, and then asked again, why did he accept the request for negotiations? He replied that there was a reason, when Dale suddenly said he hadn't asked him. Philip was surprised and asked again, "What?" Dale replied that he wasn't particularly interested in the opinion of a puppet acting as his superior. He addressed the real commander behind him, Sir Milvus, the true sword. Philip was surprised and asked again, "What did he just say?" Dale asked again, "Isn't that so? Why else would the sacred sword be trusted with command of an entire army by such a mediocrity?" Philip was angered when Milvus suddenly shouted at Lord Philip not to listen to him. Philip clenched his fists and called him a little shit. The fact that Count Brandenburg considered Philip a disgrace was a secret known only to his closest confidants. But how did the boy even know about it? Dale continued, how could it be that his deeply revered father didn't have an ounce of respect for him? At that moment, Milvus shouted that the negotiations were over. Lord Philip, they would not linger here and must return immediately. Philip's hands shook and he replied that they were returning, after which Dale said that he should at least pretend to ask his opinion. Philip grew even angrier. Dale continued to say that watching him nod along without a murmur was even embarrassing. He looked like a little dog. Was this how the firstborn of a count's family should behave? A real little dog on a short leash. Philip gritted his teeth and asked again, "A dog on a leash?" Milvus asked him not to listen, when suddenly Philip shouted at him to shut up right now. Dale watched the conversation with a smile on his face, then leaned back in his chair and said that he wasn't even sure whose puppet he was, the Holy Sword or Sir Milvus. Philip turned to Milvus and continued yelling at him. Meanwhile, Dale was reflecting on the fact that his tactic was to sow discord among the enemy. He had no intention of negotiating with them. At that moment, Dale turned to his subordinate Bale and told him to leave for a moment. He bowed and replied, "As you command, Lord Dale." When Bale left, Dale spread his arms and suggested they speak privately. Just the two of them, as an army leader with another leader, responsible for what was happening on the battlefield. Philip grew angry and shouted, "Fine." At that moment, Milvus shouted his name, after which Philip exclaimed, "Leave it all to them." Hadn't he heard his commander? Milvus didn't know how to react, but Philip continued shouting that he would deal with the brat from House Saxe himself. Milvus realized it was bad that he had fallen for this bait. After that he replied, "Everything will be as he commands," and left the tent. When they were alone, Dale turned to Philip and thanked him for it. As he had said earlier, their meeting was strictly for negotiations. Philip asked, Did he have something to offer? Dale replied that it was true. If the Knights of St. Magdalene immediately abandoned the battle, then House Sachs would supply their army with provisions for the return journey. Philip was dumbfounded and asked again. What? He considered that an offer? Dale replied, exactly. He apologized if it sounded presumptuous, but they should be prudent and deploy their troops. Otherwise, their army would be destroyed, and hundreds of knights would become prisoners of war. The reputation of the Holy Sword would be tarnished, and they would be dragged through the mud. This was their last chance to retain even a shred of dignity. Sweat began to pour down Philip's face with anger, but he rose from his seat and shouted that Milvus was right. He had been mocking them from the very beginning. He grinned and replied, "What a shame. This was his last chance." Philip asked, "What is he talking about?" Dale asked, "Isn't he scared at all?" As soon as the battle was lost, the blame would fall on one person, and it wouldn't be Sir Milvus, but the Count's incompetent and completely useless firstborn. Philip exclaimed, "What nonsense. He who laughs last laughs best." He would prove his strength to him in front of both armies. Dale smiled and calmly answered as he pleased. The negotiations failed, and soon afterward, the following events unfolded in the barony of Grinbelt. Milvus climbed up to the fortress and addressed the knights who were observing the ongoing battles through binoculars. Milvus asked them to report the enemy's actions, and the knight reported that House Sachs had begun mobilizing its knights. Milvus realized that this young man from House Saxe was surprising. His composure was astonishing. The boy was truly not simple. Even though he was only a 10-year-old, they couldn't underestimate him. But this was definitely their chance. While he was still only 10, he gripped the weapon in his hands and ordered the others to destroy it, letting it spread its wings. The knights raised their hands and exclaimed, "Teach this brat some manners." At that moment, another knight ran up to Dale and shouted that the enemy's main forces had begun to move. He smiled and replied that this was excellent, then raised his sword and declared, "Sword of House Sachs, their time has come. We must show them that their blood is no joke." All the knights shouted and supported their lord. After a while, a loud sound rang out, signaling the beginning of the battle, and the knights clashed. Blood began to spill, and Milvus began to shout, "First Cavalry Unit, forward!" The key to victory in this battle was stopping the Black Cavalry of House Sachs, but they cannot yet accurately determine the strength of the enemy knightly order. This means that to avoid unexpected losses, Lord Philip cannot be placed at the front, only in the center of the formation. Baron Parker's forces should be deployed to the left flank to reinforce the Grinbelt Knights. Meanwhile, he would lead the elite Brandenburg troops in a flank attack on the Black Cavalry of House Sachs. If the center and left flank withstood the enemy's attack, the strategy would be considered successful. They couldn't miss this chance. He shouted encouragement to his knights, who shouted back that this was dangerous. Others shouted that they would do it for their county, and continued on their way. Suddenly, the knights were stunned by what they saw, and Dale said they shouldn't act so quickly. The boys turned and realized they were saved. It turned out to be young Lord Dale, who had arrived to their aid and personally led the vanguard. Dale shouted for no one to retreat and to fight to the end. Then he raised his sword and cried out, "For House Sachs," and all his knights rushed into battle. The massacre began, and Milvus watched his actions closely. He didn't understand, so they'd intended to measure their trump cards from the very beginning, to think he'd gone along with it voluntarily. A tough guy. Milvus realized that this was exactly what he'd been after. At that moment, he abruptly raised his sword and shouted, "For the Knights of St. Magdalene, for Count Brandenburg." The knights shouted, "Don't let any enemy reach their gates. All troops, attack." The forces clashed, and a bright flash of light erupted between them. At that moment, dark beams of magical power began to appear in this bright flash, and everyone around watched in amazement. Milvus shouted that they would deal with this quickly and should follow him, the cavalry. Let them knock down Dale and put an end to this battle. They would show everyone that they were the elite. They should rush forward. Milvus approached one of the knights and pierced him through, when suddenly another knight appeared beside him and swung his sword. When the knight threatened Milvus with his sword at his throat, he became enraged and a moment later was pierced through. Milvus had handled all his enemies well and fought with all his might. When he destroyed his opponent, he didn't understand what was going on. He felt something was wrong. They had definitely pushed back the main enemy forces, but they were scattering too easily. At that moment, one of the knights shouted back that they should retreat and reform. Milvus wondered if the Black Cavalry were considered the destroyers of the battlefield. What was this vague feeling of unease in his chest? At that moment, a subordinate arrived and reported, "Captain, a message has arrived from the left flank. Baron Parker's troops are routed. They are unable to withstand the onslaught." Milvus shouted, "What? The left flank?" He was incredibly surprised as the troops continued to attack each other. One of the knights wondered why those Grinbelt oafs could use aura. At that moment, one of his subordinates turned to Lord Philip and reported that the left flank, commanded by Baron Parker, was requesting reinforcements. The Aura Knights of House Sachs had broken through their ranks. Another knight replied that this was simply impossible. How had their knights even broken through? They turned to Lord Philip and asked for further orders. Philip was angry and afraid. He remembered well Dale's words, saying that once the battle was lost, the blame would fall on one man, the incompetent and utterly useless firstborn of the Count. He decided not to let this brat win. At that moment, a knight turned to him and said he had received a message from Sir Milvas. He recommended combining the cavalry in the center and rearguard with the left flank to strengthen the defense. Philip turned and shouted at him to shut up. He extended his hand and shouted for all the cavalry to attack him. They would strike the right flank. While they were smashing the left flank, he would strangle that brat Dale with his own hands. Meanwhile, the knight informed Captain Milvas that Lord Dale and his shock troops would soon be here. He was dumbfounded and asked again, "What?" Clutching his head, Milvas said that he had clearly told him to preserve the left flank. He was just a useless idiot. The right flank was already pushing back the weakened left flank of the enemy, and strengthening it would only hinder their advance and reduce their effectiveness. But this fool, blinded by the sole thought of striking the enemy commander, ignored all calls for help. It would be a disaster. At this rate, the left flank would break completely, and they would find themselves trapped. One of the knights shouted at him, "Captain, they need to retreat." Milvas replied, "No, not yet." All the knights exchanged silent glances, stunned. Milvas replied that the battle wasn't over. Dale, on the other hand, watched with a smirk and confidently stared ahead. Milvas grew angry and declared that this insolent man was already celebrating victory. He would wipe that smug smirk off his face. At that moment, he raised his sword and shouted, "First cavalry unit. Only one unit remains." The knights shouted that they were awaiting orders, that he would just give them the order. Milvas considered this and decided that from that moment on, they would begin to break through the enemy line and take the head of the enemy commander. By the time of St. Magdalene, may their sword guide them. May the protection of the goddess of life be with them. May the sister goddesses bless them. He opened his ominous eyes and shouted loudly at his knights. They must draw their swords and follow him. All the knights obeyed their commander's order and rushed after him. He continued shouting that they were doing this for St. Magdalene. As they approached the protagonist, Dale noticed and turned around. He realized they had finally fallen for his trick and smiled. On the front lines, a commander's field of vision always quickly narrows. At that moment, he stopped and, turning back, drew his arrow, thinking that the hardships of war and anxiety dulled his ability to think clearly. Perhaps the army, too, couldn't escape this fate. At that moment, he froze and asked again, "Magic?" The protagonist smiled and used an ice bullet. Then he asked again, "Is this the first time he's seen magic?" Thanks to this magic arrow aimed at an entire knightly regiment, the army began to crumble. One by one, the horses began to fall, along with their riders. Milvas turned around in fear and realized he was shooting so accurately, some of them galloping forward. The spell itself already impressed him, but without proper horsemanship and archery skills, he wouldn't have been able to hit the target. At that moment, the protagonist cast a spell to summon an ice wall. At that moment, an ice wall appeared in front of the knights, blocking their entire path. The knights were dumbfounded by what they saw, and Dale shouted, "Now! All forces must rush to the attack." All the knights listened to their lord's order and shouted that they must not let their swords reach the young lord. They would protect him with their lives. A moment later, they began to fight tooth and nail with their enemies, and Milvas clutched his head, realizing they'd been tricked. Their original goal wasn't him and his squad, but division. To top it all off, Lord Philip had made the worst possible move. Philip watched as the knights around him lost their heads. Because of him, the main forces had shifted to the right flank, and their formations were now completely destroyed. He screamed with incredible anger and cursed. So this was the only option now, but before he could fully consider this sentence, he suddenly cried out loudly, trying to break through this ice wall and the spell. He grabbed his sword and shouted that this was the end. Lord Dale. He couldn't stand against him. Dale was prepared for this and smiled. A moment later, Milvas was kneeling in front of him, and Dale looked down on him. It seemed someone was overestimating the power of the Aura Knights. The combat doctrines developed by the Knightly Order of St. Magdalene sometimes become their fatal weakness. The one who had captured him in his past life was the head of this order, the Holy Sword. So, whether he liked it or not, he eventually became familiar with many of the customs of the Knightly Order of St. Magdalene under his command. He knows them like the back of his hand. At that moment, his subordinate exclaimed, "Young Master Dale, Baron Grinbelt's knights have succeeded." The left flank commander, Baron Parker, was also captured. Milvas was furious that all of this had happened because of that idiot Philip. Dale approached him and said that it seemed Philip didn't really trust him. Milvas replied, "What do you mean? He planned this all along and lured them into his trap." Dale smiled and replied that anything can happen on the battlefield, and no one can know how things will turn out. And in this endless chaos, those who ultimately doom themselves have only their own stupidity to blame. In accordance with the traditions of the great empire, he was prepared to show mercy to those who begged for mercy for a few gold coins. So, will they pray for their lives? At that moment, one of the knights shouted, "Don't make him laugh. They would rather die than beg him." Dale snapped his fingers and asked again, "Really?" He'd used his magical power to pierce one of the opposing knights, telling him to die if he did. He let out a terrifyingly loud cry of piercing pain, then turned to Milvas and asked, "What about him?" He stared silently at the ground, when suddenly the knights under his command were dumbfounded when they saw him bow before Dale. He knew he wasn't afraid to die, but only then would he show the knights how dangerous this man was. At that moment he shouted for everyone to kneel immediately. They were invoking the merciful traditions of the empire and surrendering, and also asking for proper treatment of prisoners of war. Dale looked at him silently, then asked again, so they're even willing to beg on their knees for mercy? In that case, he wouldn't drag this out any longer and said, no. Milvus was surprised and looked at him in bewilderment, when suddenly Dale sharply stated that none of them would survive and smiled. After that, he ordered them all to be killed. Even the warriors of the Allied Order held their breath for a moment at these words. According to Imperial custom, captured knights were released after a ransom was paid, but Dale's voice was unyielding. Within moments, all of the commander's knights were slain and destroyed, except Milvus. For Sax's knights, only his orders existed, but only one man was responsible for what had happened. Milvus grew enraged and screamed that he was nothing but a vile scum. Did he really think he would surrender so easily? At that moment, he grabbed his sword and rushed at Dale, but a second later, the knights pierced him and killed him. He fell to the ground, lying in a pool of his own blood, and when Dale approached him, he said, does he remember his death? Milvus was stunned by what he heard, and Dale whispered in his ear that he remembered it well, and his face that night. He was there too. When his lord plunged his sword into his back, he stood there smiling, so now he asks him one more time, young knight, does he remember his death? Milvus screamed in horror and exclaimed that it was simply impossible. Had he truly returned to life, monster? At that moment, dark forces consumed his body, and Dale confidently answered him, yes. Only now did he finally feel satisfaction. Meanwhile, the battle continued, and Philip's remaining knights perished right before his eyes. He lowered his gaze in despair and realized that when he came to his senses, it was all over. The cavalry on the right flank had been routed, Milvus and the Aura Knight killed. The left flank had also long since been broken through, and the cavalry was surrounded by the main forces. He recalled Dale's gaze and his grin. Clutching his head, he wondered why he continued to see them. At that moment, one of the knights cried out, young Master Philip, he asks you to make a decision now. Philip continued to clutch his head and muttered that they could not lose like this. The knights looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he had just said. He shouted at them all to stand and not retreat. Their knightly order would never kneel. The knight replied that if they did not retreat, it would be the end for them. Philip asked again, would he contradict his commander? They must go forward to the last battle. At that moment, another knight ran up to him and cried out. Philip became frightened and shouted to stop him and protect him. If only he had known that everything would turn out like this, he would have drunk more often and hugged his women tighter, and would have preferred to die in bed, not on the damned battlefield. He covered himself with his hand. Meanwhile, the knights, led by Dale, shouted with joy. Everything went according to plan, my lord. Nothing less was expected from young Master Dale. Master Philip was captured and shouted at him to let him go immediately. Dale replied that it seemed he truly didn't know when to retreat. Philip was already kneeling in front of Dale, shouting at him to choke on his victory. He might have won the battle, but not the war. Dale replied that those were rather strong words for someone who wanted to run away and save only his own skin. Philip replied that he bore the cross of a commander, and naturally he must survive at any cost. Dale smirked and asked again, really? Well, since his battle was over, he figured he had no reason to stay alive. At that moment, Philip held his hands out in front of him and shouted for him to wait, then shouted, okay, he accepts his duel. He would bet everything on the outcome of this fight, as he had proposed. At that moment, Bale commented, how absurd. The protagonist replied that everything was fine, then said, okay, he accepts this. Philip smiled and rose from his seat, when suddenly he shouted that he was caught. In his thoughts, Philip went crazy and thought he knew he would agree to this. Let him die, the arrogant brat. Philip swung his sword, determined to defeat his opponent, but Dale, with a calm expression, attacked him with his magical powers, causing Philip to stumble back. He was dumbfounded and didn't understand what had just happened. When he fell to the ground, he began rolling from side to side, screaming for mercy and not to kill him. He begged, but Dale looked at him with irritation and said, so he intended to be so pathetic until his death. Thus, a grand war with loud slogans ended with a ridiculous scream. Sometime later, the protagonist was greeted at the palace with joy and celebration. Everyone shouted that the young master had returned victorious. People around him were discussing how he had successfully carried out an operation to encircle and destroy the Knights of St. Magdalene. Many enemy forces were killed. Dale felt uncomfortable and embarrassed. One of the people who arrived at the pier asked these guys, what's so good about this? A sea of blood had been spilled on this battlefield. Did God really want all these people dead? Now this child's blade is aimed at the enemy, but one day he will not hesitate to direct it at his own people. It was Cardinal Nikolai, from the Church of the Goddess of Life. He grinned and decided to influence the people around him. When Dale arrived at the estate, he entered the room where his parents and sister greeted him. Liz was the first to run out and screamed with joy. He hugged her and asked if she missed him. Liz replied that she missed him very much and hugged him back. Uncle Helmut approached him and congratulated him on his victory in his first battle. Young Master Dale. Dale thanked him with a smile on his face, then approached his parents and sister by the hand. Charlotte and Sepia stood nearby, watching his steps with smiles. When Dale approached his parents, he bowed and said that Dale of House Saxe officially reports the enemy has been defeated, His Grace. Dale placed his hand over his heart and knelt to convey this joyful news. Noir replied that he had done a magnificent job and led his troops to victory. Dale responded that this victory was only possible thanks to the sword of House Saxe. He turned to Sir Bale and thanked him for guiding Dale. Elena smiled and said that he must be very tired after the battle. He should go and rest. Dale thanked his mother for this and smiled into her face. He had not been home for several months, and the feeling of being home was only now dawning on him. Meanwhile, Lord Brandenburg was furious at the terrible news. He turned to his crippled subordinates and asked where this Philip was, and why only the two of them had returned. One replied that the entire knightly order of St. Magdalene, including the Milvas and the Knights of Aura, had been destroyed. House Saxe had captured young Master Philip, along with a small circle of his subordinates. They were demanding a huge ransom. Brandenburg replied that everything was clear. So they were routed and fled to save their skins? He screamed terrifyingly at his subordinates and asked again, do they know what happens to deserters? The men, with tears in their eyes, shouted back that this was an excuse and begged for mercy. Brandenburg shouted at the others to throw them into the dungeon. He would make them beg for death. The men shouted at their count to stop, but he was merciless. Word gradually spread of the battle, later marked as a turning point between the black and white factions. Dale, who had shown no mercy to his enemies, was proclaimed Dark Lord. His 11th birthday approached. When he entered his father's office, Noir announced that he was already 11 years old and had a gift for him. At the upcoming birthday ceremony, he would appoint him Viscount of the ducal territory of Saxe. The protagonist was dumbfounded and surprised. The title of Viscount allows one to exercise authority as the Lord's official representative. In this way, his father fulfills his obligation to respect him as an equal to the head of the house. Dale thanked his father for the honor and mentioned that, while he was at it, he would like to do something as his lordship's representative. Noir asked curiously, what is it? Dale replied that rumor had it that the Dark Lord had shown cruelty in that battle, sparing no prisoners of war, and also that the poor unfortunate knights, guided by God's will, fell victim to it. The church won't like that. Let him go on a pilgrimage to the papal states of Zestina. He intends to atone for his sins. Noir considered his proposal, then said he didn't understand it at all. Fear is a tremendous asset offering incomparable advantages, and he wants to give it up for the sake of the church's favor? He replied that their favor was worth it. Noir asked what he was up to again. He replied that he was indeed planning to make them an offer they couldn't refuse. Dale considered that this would also allow him access to forbidden grimoires. A few days before this situation, he had slept very poorly in his bed. He had a dream, and an unknown voice said, "Does he remember? Does he remember his death?" It was a skeleton, shaking his body. Dale replied that he remembered. The skeleton asked him to remember death and struck him square in the chest. At that moment, he woke up in fright and clutched his chest. He realized that this nightmare was the abyss of the mind. It was the darkest scene he'd seen in the world of the mind since he discovered it to form his third circle. For a mage, practicing control over his inner world is everything. But he was tormented by loneliness and nightmares from this very world. It was simply unbelievable. He was still too inept, and to fully control his world of the mind, he needed more power. Just as a sword faithfully serves its knight, grimoires serve a mage. After some time, a new, sunny day dawned. Originally, at the border between Baron Grinbelt's territory, where the turning point between the Black and Whites had occurred, Baron Parker's territory marked the end of the northern regions of the Empire and the beginning of the Central Lands, inaccessible to the Duke of Saxe. Parker, defeated in the battle against Dale, had only one option left for defense, and that was robbery. He fought alongside his subordinates and shouted, "Fire!" These arrows attacked the passing motorcade. When the knights stopped them, they asked how they dared trespass on Parker's defensive territory without asking permission to enter. What did they want? The knights smiled, and the opponents continued shouting, "Isn't it natural to pay a toll when someone wants to enter a nobleman's territory?" Dale sat inside the carriage, pondering, a good eavesdropper. When he stepped outside, he said, "Well, since it comes down to it," he had prepared a certain amount for the toll. When the knights opened the sack, they were surprised to find it was quite a significant toll. They saw that their intentions were sincere, so this time he would let them pass. Let them pass. The carriage drove into the palace, and the knights smiled ominously as they watched them go. They continued on their way, when suddenly the unknown one shouted at them to stop. It was the other knights who shouted that this was Baron Parker's road, so they should show respect to the Baron. How dare they enter their territory without paying the toll? Dale, looking in their direction, asked, "Tax?" But they had just paid their comrades. "Is it legal to collect a tax multiple times from a single entry?" The bandit shouted, "Paid? What nonsense are they talking?" He's seeing them for the first time. They honor the laws of the Empire like no one else. If they value their lives, they must give everything they have. The unspoken rule after the turning point between Black and White speaks for itself. Baron Park sets the tone here. He is, after all, the hero of that battle. At that moment, Dale smiled and made a very loud noise, which stunned the knights. When he took off his hood, he asked, "A hero, they say?" But he remembers everything differently. One of the knights was dumbfounded when he saw him and shouted that this simply couldn't be. "Young Master Dale," he shouted to his subordinates, "don't panic. And just the two of them. They can win this battle." A multitude of knights crowded the slope and decided to attack the protagonist from different sides. The archers were to aim directly at him. Bale stepped to the ground and said that he awaited his orders, young Master Dale. He replied that they had enough of this childishness and must kill everyone. At that moment, one of the knights aimed his arrow at him, and they thought they could shoot them that way. But Dale, without making a move, trusted Bale, who destroyed all the arrows. He used his magical powers and replied that he understood his master. The knights realized that their arrows had been destroyed with incredible ease. At that moment, Bale pounced on the first of them and shattered his arm. He looked ahead confidently and rushed at the remaining knights, who were screaming and begging for mercy. Their commander shook and said that this simply could not be. He fell at the protagonist's knee and cried, "Young master, may he please forgive them. He swears to be faithful to him for the rest of his life." With these words, he handed him a bag of gold and continued shouting at him to show mercy to the goddess's sister. Dale smiled and asked again, why should he do such a thing? He had encountered many bandits like these while traveling across the central continent. Several weeks later, they finally arrived at the appointed place. When they looked ahead, they saw the incredibly beautiful papal state of Justina. They arrived there on a small boat by water. Bale steered it and announced that this was Pusil, the city of the Holy See. He looked around, wondering, the city of the Holy See? What nonsense. Although he had arrived disguised as a pilgrim, in reality, the word judge would be more appropriate. When he approached the gates of this palace, he confidently looked ahead and waited for the doors to open for him. When he entered the main office, he was greeted by His Eminence, Cardinal Nicholas. He smiled back, and Dale reflected on the white mage of Circle 6, one of the 12 clergymen who stood at the very top of the church hierarchy. Nikolai remarked that much blood was said to have been spilled on the battlefield that day, young Master Dale. The victims were adherents of the Knights of St. Magdalene. Truly tragic news. Dale knelt and replied that he was also saddened by the fact that such an event was considered a turning point between the blacks and the whites. Because of his short-sightedness, more casualties occurred than were necessary. And so, to atone for the blood he had cursed, revealing his power and status, he personally came to the Papal States on a pilgrimage. Bale frowned, watching Nikolai's reaction. Dale asked he hoped Nikolai shared his beliefs. At that moment, Nikolai was reflecting on Dale, the heir to the House of Saxe, the son of the Master of the Black Tower, and if rumors were to be believed, the greatest child genius of all time. Could the horrors of battle have triggered a sense of guilt? He supposed that despite his brilliant talent, he was still an ordinary 11-year-old boy. How wonderfully everything was working out. He had said that the goddess was merciful to everyone equally, young master, and that there was no sin in this world that could not be atoned for. Dale silently clutched his chest and said nothing. A moment later, he spoke up. There is no sin in this world that could not be atoned for. Nikolai answered, exactly. And at that moment, Dale asked, so, is he selling the nation to the goddess of the empire? At that moment, Nikolai was dumbfounded and, grinning, said that his joke was too serious. Dale replied that just before the theocratic state was annexed by the empire, people say that 12 cardinal bishops tried to persuade the previous archbishop to agree to it. His Eminence was among them. However, the previous archbishop refused to listen to these persuasions until the very end, after which he was treacherously murdered by a conspiracy between the cardinal bishops and the empire's hunting dogs. Has the goddess forgiven them for their sin? The sale of their own country, His Eminence? Nikolai became enraged after these words, suddenly saying that he says he longs for redemption, but he himself is speaking such nonsense? He was so angry that bright rays of light emanated from his body, and he screamed, does he really think the merciful goddess will now favor him? This is very funny. Dale asked again, does he really think that killing a simple representative of the Duke makes the world indifferent? The Duke has no intention of digging into the church's dirty laundry, which is what they want, so this is the price for their silence. Of course, this was all a lie. Duke Noir probably had no idea he'd orchestrated it. Nikolai grew even more angry and, frowning, said nothing for a long moment. An awkward silence ensued, after which Nikolai said everything would be as he wished. Dale smiled and replied that he'd heard that the top level of the cathedral's dungeon contained a secret archive where the church kept forbidden books. These words surprised Nikolai greatly, and Dale asked for full access to the legal texts whenever he wished. He understood that the world's most terrifying grimoire, the Book of the Black Goat, was located on the lower level. As he descended into the library with a lamp, he reflected on the fact that only one person was permitted to enter the restricted section. Before entering, Nikolai told him that the church had no responsibility for anything happening down there. He could also take only one grimoire with him. He was forbidden to touch the rest. He must also swear an oath of eternal silence about their secret. Dale replied that he swears by the Duke of Noir. This is a sacred oath, which Nikolai handed over to him. It is sealed with their own hearts, and he and the cardinal have sealed their oath with a magical contract, the pride of the White Magical Tower. Dale knew that without a doubt, if he broke the contract, his heart would break, and in any case, it wasn't such a big secret. When he approached the gate, he spoke the phrase written on the wall about this, and told all who enter to have hope. He looked ahead in surprise and nevertheless entered, opening the gate. Dale was tense and left the lamp behind. It's not without reason that this place is called Adam. This vast dungeon is called a library, and all the forbidden books stored here are uncontrolled treasures that have led to disasters. But just as an orthodox knight needs a good sword, a mage needs his grimoire. No matter how dangerous or imperfect it may be, The desire to possess an exceptional grimoire is completely natural for a mage. When he entered the corner of the library, he noticed something amiss. There were many magical knights, and he realized they were the guardians of this place. It seemed strange to him that a corpse would be used by those who boasted of their power of light. At that moment, the monsters pounced on him, but the protagonist easily crushed their heads with a single movement. No one was watching here, which meant he had no need to pretend. He used shadow bullet magic and routed the remaining knights who were attacking him. When they were all dead and unconscious, Dale remarked how pleasant it was to unleash his true power, and now he wanted to finish his business. He grabbed a dagger and cut his palm to draw blood. His blood began to dissolve into the air, and he uttered that he, Dale of House Saxe, hereby proclaimed himself the rightful heir to the Duke's immortal bloodline. As the drops fell to the ground, he uttered that the Black Goat of the Forest, commanding 1,000 descendants, was summoning him. He must come to fulfill the contract he and his clan of darkness had made. Dale realized he was hearing terrifying sounds of unknown origin, indicating that this blood was so powerful. He was dumbfounded and continued listening. Fresh blood of a mage. He wanted to make a contract. Let this child come here. He was digging this power for him. This child had made a contract not with him, but with another. These spirits began to argue among themselves about this, and one of them felt hatred and thirst, killing death. Dale looked up, wondering if the sea of blood and scattered corpses was the world inside the book. One of the spirits offered to make a contract with him, and he would kill every last one of his enemies. He would hold a festival in the ocean of blood of those who stood in his way. Dale turned and looked at this creature with curiosity. Then he felt a strange atmosphere. That was the world of the grimoire, the Book of Carnage. The Book of Carnage is the secret art of the most depraved blood magic aimed at mass murder. As the name suggests, the power and value of this book are beyond comprehension. However, Dale asked the spirit to leave him. He didn't need him. He grew angry and shouted, "How dare he refuse him? Did he really think he could leave alive after this?" Dale smirked and asked, "Why not?" He used his magical powers, causing his opponent to retreat. This is just a pitiful world inside the book. His world can't influence him, and with his world, it's just the opposite. A moment later, the entire aura of the book shifted, and the protagonist began to wonder about the world consuming another world. It belonged to a bloodthirsty monster whose twisted thoughts had given birth to the magic of mass destruction. How could the world of a sixth circle mage yield so easily to pressure? The spirit asked in response. How could the world of a child absorb him? Dale replied that it was simple. The number of people his master had killed was nothing compared to his own body count. He didn't even remember how many cities he'd razed to the ground. Now he understands, right? The spirit screamed in anger and lunged at him with his weapon, shouting, "Does he really think he would give in so easily?" A moment later, he was completely shattered into tiny pieces and watched in bewilderment. He muttered that it was simply impossible and began to evaporate into blood. When the protagonist looked up, he heard a cracking sound and asked, "Is that her again?" A girl named Riri approached him and said, "Handsome man, why did you summon her?" He turned to her in confusion and she said she was truly glad to see him. She'd been terribly lonely this whole time. He would play with her, right? It was so cold and empty here. He silently watched her actions and remembered the Book of the Black Goat, a grimoire written by the immortal Duke Federico, who sacrificed his own daughter to reveal the secrets of death. That's why, although the grimoire's avatar took the form of a little girl, the one standing before him was not his daughter. Let her make a contract with him. The daughter of the Black Goat. She replied, "Okay, let him show her his world. He's a handsome guy." He replied, "Okay." And when Riri found herself in his world, she said with delight, "Is this his world? It's very beautiful." She really likes it. But suddenly they found themselves in front of Nikolai and his subordinates, and she asked, "Who are they?" Nikolai was stunned by what he saw and realized he hadn't thought this brat would actually get his hands on that book. Dale turned to Nikolai and asked why he'd come all this way. He replied that he simply had, but Dale interrupted his agonizing reply and asked again, "Whatever happened down there? The church had nothing to do with it. Hadn't he said so? Had he really been worried? Apparently an oath alone wasn't enough. He'd come all this way to get rid of him. And he, a light mage, had chosen the wrong place. Nikolai grinned and replied that there had been a misunderstanding. He'd come because he was worried about him. Suddenly, Riri addressed Dale as a handsome man and asked if she could eat them. He turned around and replied that if she got a stomachache later, it wasn't his fault. She replied, "Okay." Nikolai grabbed his cross and said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit," and began to cross himself. "May he have mercy on them and grant them his mercy." They pray to her, "Lord, it will come to them in the mercy and blessing of the goddess. The Lord of Light will protect them." They pray together, "Hallelujah. May she deliver them from the devil's servant." Dale watched what was happening and replied that, as he thought, it would not be easy for them. At that moment, Nikolai's subordinates transformed into archangels with enormous wings and rushed to attack. Dale deftly avoided each attack and used a shadow bullet to hit and destroy his opponents. He said they were agile and could have evaded his attacks, but he expected nothing less from the angels. Nikolai asked if he might be a genius, but he was still a mage of the third circle. He could not fully wield the power of the Book of the Black Goat. At that moment, he continued reciting a prayer, and everything around him lit up with a bright light. Dale and Riri couldn't bear to listen any longer, when suddenly she screamed at him to shut up right now, growing even more enraged. She stood in the middle of the field, unsure what to do. Her tentacles were immobilized, and the angels were drawing ever closer, shouting that she must accept her sentence. Fallen one. She smiled, and at that moment, one of the closest angels was frozen in horror. They had all been routed by Riri's dark magic, which had simply lured them closer. Nikolai asked if they were okay. They couldn't do anything, and Nikolai was stunned by what he saw. The angels began to transform into terrifyingly frightening creatures, clutching their heads. Nikolai, unsure of what was happening, was frozen in horror. They all kept repeating the same thing, praise him, and this sight horrified the cardinal. The knights were stained with black slime, melting their skin and snow-white wings, and Riri enjoyed their screams. She extended her tentacles to one of them and said that she had not smelled this scent in a long time. She had waited for this for so long, so she should savor it properly, very slowly. The tentacles finished off the knights in a brutal manner. An evil entity devouring angelic flesh, the one who summoned it, a young master of the dark race, could not possibly be an ordinary 11-year-old boy. Words like prodigy of the ducal house or the greatest genius of the empire did not fully describe him. This was truly the spawn of the devil. This is exactly what Cardinal Nikolai realized now. Dale ominously approached him and said that no matter what happened, the parties bear no responsibility for what happened here. These are his words, right? Nikolai fell on his knees before him and begged him to spare him, and he asked, does he really want to live? Then what will he offer him in return? Nikolai looked up at him and excitedly said that he can offer him a lot of money and a church rank. And if he wishes, he will also get all the influence of the church under his command. Let him just say what he wants. He will give him everything. MC remarked that it sounded tempting. Nikolai smiled nervously, asking what exactly interested him, and he spread his arms out to the sides, saying that he was talking about everything he has. It looks like they need to change the contract. A vow, absolute submission, bound by an oath. At that moment, Nikolai had no other choice. When he finished with his business and returned to Riri, she said with a smile that it was so fun to play with him. She really likes his world, so she will wait for the next command. She grinned and showed him her tentacles, asking if he was afraid of her. Was he? He answered with a smile that he was not at all, and thought that she should not be summoned carelessly. It was too dangerous. He could not yet fully control this power, so he should not use it recklessly. It was better for him to save it as a trump card and use it at the last moment. She approached him and hugged him with her tentacles, asking if he would invite her to play again, right? He promised her that they would meet again and play together, and then she left, saying that she would look forward to their next meeting, and he returned to the real world. This is where the hellish confusion ended. The eldest son of House Saxe received repentance for his sins on behalf of Cardinal Nikolai Moshi. As a great act of atonement and a bridge to reconciliation between House Saxe and the church, an unprecedented sacred ceremony was held. On the way back to the duchy, Dale no longer hid behind the pilgrim's mask, but no one dared stand in his way. A few months later, Charlotte demonstrated her abilities. Helmut told her to begin, and she concentrated, gradually releasing aura from herself and directing it to the sword. When the blade was completely covered in aura, she said that was all she could do. The others cheered, admiring her abilities, and Helmut remarked that it was incredible. To think that at such a young age, she had already achieved perfect mastery of the aura blade. Afterwards, MC approached her and said that he, Dale of House Saxe, wanted to ask her, for the sake of the Lord, the honor of her house, and all that is dear, does she swear to protect him as a loyal knight? She thrust the sword into the ground and knelt before him, swearing this, and he touched the blade to her shoulder and asked if she swears not to follow her own selfish desires, to protect the weak and punish evil. She swore this, and he said that by the name Saxe he named her his knight, and she smiled contentedly. After that, they went for a walk together, and he said that he hoped she would not change her mind. She told him that she liked the sword of House Saxe. This sword made her who she really was. He thought that she herself preferred the two-handed sword of House Saxe to the rapier. Retraining must have been difficult. Perhaps he underestimated her talent. He said that they received a report that a huge contingent of orcs was gathering outside the Demon King's territory. It seemed that they were led by an elite commander. His father was personally mobilizing troops and calling on the Northern Lords, but he also intended to join them, and he wants her to stand shoulder to shoulder with him in this battle. Let her join him as a knight. She thought for a moment, then told him that she agreed. She will become the sword that protects the Lord. Her blade will serve him faithfully. Meanwhile, Noir called everyone to a meeting. One of the lords said that they had detected a large-scale advance of an orc detachment from the south of the evil territory, the land of the Demon King to the north of here. Perhaps this is just another wave of barbarian attacks? The Duke said that it was most likely so. When Han Sun joined the human forces to crush the Demon King, the people believed that peace would finally come. But the truth was that some demonic races fled south from the barbarian lands to survive. In the following years, their raids became known as barbarian attacks. The Duke said that an order had been given to convene the Northern Lords, the Dark Magic Tower, and all the wards of the Knightly Orders. This battle would be larger than any before. He turned to his son and said that the time had come to teach him how to use necromancy on the battlefield. That same day, in the Dark Duke's underground workshop, his first lesson in using necromancy on the battlefield began. His father asked him what he thought was the difference between a Death Knight and an undead soldier. He asked if it was the same difference as between a knight and a foot soldier. His father looked him up and down and asked, then what was the difference between a knight and a foot soldier? He thought about it and asked, in combat prowess? He shook his head and said that it was true, and at the same time, not so. Even if a person possesses great strength, it does not mean he can become a knight. He asked, so the difference is in the ability to use the blade's aura? His father confirmed this and approached the dead man, saying that this knight had recently fallen in battle. It was an aura knight who swore to dedicate his body to House Sax even after death. He snapped his fingers, and dark energy flowed into his body, forcing him to rise, and he said that the higher the level of the aura knight in life, the stronger the death knight will be when raised from the dead. He needs to remember this. This is a proud knight, both in life and in death. MC looked at the dead man with a smile, and his father told him to follow him. He wanted to show him something. They walked down the stairs for a while, and Dale wondered how deep they were already underground. His father asked if he knew about the founder of their house, the immortal Duke Frederick. He knew him. Right now, his grimoire was in his heart. He nervously answered him that he knew him from his history and the books he read. Noir said that he was a monster thirsting for forbidden truths. He was the one who sacrificed his own daughter without hesitation. What he was about to show him was the result of his scientific research and the sin of House Sax, for which they are still paying to this day. This is the darkness of a bygone era. They passed through the barrier, and it said that only direct descendants in whose veins the blood of Sax flows could enter. They found themselves in a spacious hall, where a crowd of knights stood, and MC asked, what is this? Noir said that a way to control the dead without constantly consuming mana is exactly what the immortal Duke discovered centuries ago. One by one, the heads of House Sax cultivated an army of the dead, called the Order of Death. He, too, carries out the will of the immortal Duke. Dale stared at them in shock and clenched his teeth. Now he understood everything. His father said that the way his will is reinforced by actions is impressive. This is why House Sax cut itself off from the rest of the world, and why the Dark Duke emphasized the importance of morality so much, despite controlling the power of darkness. All for the sake of keeping the Order of Death a secret. His first reaction was, what hypocrisy is this? It makes him sick. His father looked at him and pointed at the knights, saying that this is their darkness, but at the same time, a shield that protects them. Is he ready to accept this sin? MC nervously clenched his teeth and clutched his heart, and then answered that he was ready from the very beginning. He, Dale of House Sax, willingly accepts this sin. No matter how vicious this power is, he is the same hypocrite, hiding behind the mask of an obedient son, building up his strength for personal vengeance. He extended his hand towards one of the knights and was enveloped in dark energies. He immediately took up his sword, made several heavy swings, and Noir told his son that his mana had reached incredible concentration. He noted that this was all because he was being taught by the best of teachers, but he still couldn't control the Death Knight without infusing mana into him. He wasn't like the other Death Knights of the Order of Death. His father said it was too early for him. He only planned to teach him how to use necromancy in combat. He should focus on his training to prepare for the upcoming battle. He snapped his fingers, and the goblins lying on the altars rose from the dead. They immediately pounced on the knight, but he quickly turned and swung his sword, cutting down each of them at Dale's command. Noir smiled and thought it was simply amazing. A Death Knight is control on a completely different level. Usually, a necromancer who controls the dead has never held a sword in life, but MC demonstrates an excellent level of mastery of the sword of his controlled unit, surpassing the abilities of a knight of the Order of the Night Raven in life. He is truly incredible, but where did he get such talent? Time passed, and it was time for Sepia's lessons. As she watched his magic, she looked down in frustration and wondered what this feeling was. He had pretended to be an innocent child all this time, but everything he had shown so far was permeated with cold, indescribable darkness and desperate desire. It was certainly a thirst for recognition. Dale fired another magic shot, piercing the tree trunk, and she said that his water control skills had improved significantly. He thanked her with a smile and said that he had promised his father that he would become a son he could be proud of. She said that he was doing great at it, and noticing that he had thoughtfully lowered his gaze, she asked what that worried look on his face was. Had something happened? He looked away and smiled nervously, asking if she would love him as much when she saw his ugly side. She was slightly surprised because she had just thought about it, and he said that the day would come when he would accept his family's dark past, and then he was afraid she would be disappointed in him. She touched his face, and he looked up at her in surprise, seeing the worry in her eyes. She said that elves live along as a real man. One day she will probably look the same as she did now. At that moment, she wondered why she was so worried about the fate of this child. When rumors spread about the young master's crushing victory, which became a turning point between the white and black, the people of the Empire began to praise Dale's talent and gossip behind his back. But this never made her happy. The god of carnage, Dale's talent is definitely the engine of history, but she does not want this boy to follow the path of a killer. Now she smiled and said that she will stay by his side until he decides what he truly desires. And when that time comes, she will be with him not as his teacher, but as an ordinary woman, so he is not alone. He stared at her in shock, and she, awkwardly clearing her throat, suggested that he return to the lesson. Immediately after that, he ran up to her and hugged her tightly, thanking her for these words. He likes her very much, so let her wait for him. She smiled and agreed. Entrusting himself to that warmth that makes one forget the cold in his chest, and even his loneliness, was his childhood promise, which he could not forget. Soon after, all the lords of the north gathered in the duchy to resist the barbarian raids. Wilhelm Gale knelt before the Grand Duke and greeted him, saying that he had 30 knights, hundreds of heavy infantry, and 400 light infantry with him. It was the turn of another lord to introduce himself. By order of the Duke of Saxe, all the landed lords, great and small, gathered in one place. Among them were nobles, brimming with ambition and desperate to attract the Duke's attention. Wilhelm introduced his eldest son, Beth, to the Duke, who immediately exclaimed that, as his father had said, they were ready to give their lives for his grace. They all spoke the same thing, each boasting of their children's achievements more loudly than the last and seeking favor. Even under the pressure of the approaching battle, the nobles did not miss the opportunity to establish connections. However, for the great lord himself, it was also important to strengthen the prestige of his faction. Both the northern lords and their children knew perfectly well whom they needed to impress. Beth approached Dale and greeted him, expressing his respect. His name is Beth Gale, and he looks forward to sharing his valor on the battlefield. A girl rudely pushed him aside and greeted Dale with a smile, saying that he was even more gallant than rumor had said. She didn't even know he was a true gentleman. He smiled awkwardly and thought that the excessive attention from people was so exhausting. After that, Yonez approached him and said that they said he possessed martial prowess, not inferior to that of veteran knights. He would like to see it with his own eyes. His father indignantly called out to him and asked how he dared to say such a thing. What insolence in front of the young master! MC waved his hand, showing that everything was fine, and then asked, "He is the second son of Baron Kenneth, right?" He knelt before him and confirmed it, and he asked, "Is he saying that he wants to look at his prowess, that is, he wants to test his abilities?" Yonez replied that thanks to his exceptional talent, at such a young age, he led his troops to victory, turning the knightly order of St. Magdalene into a sea of blood. He doesn't doubt his abilities, he just wants to learn something from him, and so he asks him to duel him. His father began to scold him, but Dale smirked contentedly and said that he heard he commands a mercenary company of 100 men. He became a wandering knight and forged his loyal soldiers from mercenaries in brutal battles. He rubbed his chin with a satisfied smile and thought that as the second son, he could not possibly inherit the land by the law of primogeniture. Perhaps this was his way of proving himself, albeit a risky one. A wandering knight without support had gathered a company of 100 men, so he could be of use to him. He smiled and accepted his challenge, after which everyone dispersed to the corners of the hall to make room for the duel, which was organized right there on the spot. It was an excellent opportunity for a show of strength before the war, so the Dark Duke had no reason to interfere. Yonez pulled out his sword, and MC said he hoped so. He knew his sword was different from the usual ones. The guy confirmed it. He'd heard about it, and then Dale released his energy and allowed him to use his aura, letting him fight him with his full power. That was an order. Yonez nervously gritted his teeth and agreed, then abruptly released his aura and prepared himself. And MC thought that he was clearly still an inept aura knight, and yet his control was worth noting. Then he wouldn't hesitate either. His energy rushed to the center of the room. A sword emerged from it, and Yonez thought that here it was, the young master's famous black sword. Dale told him to attack whenever he wanted, and he immediately jumped up and approached him, then delivered a stabbing blow that only tore his cloak, and he managed to step aside. Then Yonez turned to him and swung his sword, and he parried his attack and smiled. The guy thought that, unlike him, the dark young master was born with everything, but he would prove to him that even a penniless person can defeat someone who was born with everything. He quickly ran up to Dale, and when he saw an opening, he decided to strike right away and swung his sword.